Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a time when smelling like death wasn't a metaphor. It was just normal. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a period of knights, castles, and most importantly, overwhelming, unrelenting, nose-searing stench. Like, we're talking a time when the concept of deodorant was about as real as dragons, and people genuinely thought touching water might kill them. It's going to get pretty grimy, and honestly, you probably won't survive this. Not with your olfactory system intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean it. No pressure. Drop your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I love seeing how far this strange little history community stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by imagining the first thing to hit you as you walk into a medieval town. Not the sight of towering stone walls or knights clanking down the street, but the smell. Your nose wrinkles involuntarily. It's not one smell, not really. It's a horrible symphony. Rotting meat, human sweat baked into layers of wool, horse manure, decaying vegetables, and the unmistakable tang of urine baking in the sun. The odour clings like a second skin, and you're not even through the city gates yet. The truth is, hygiene in the medieval period was a concept held together by two strings and a prayer. People simply didn't bathe regularly. Most folks, rich or poor, maybe washed once or twice a year. The idea of a daily shower would have been not just foreign but suspicious. Water, after all, had this nasty habit of being filled with disease, or so they thought, and so many believed it was better to not open your pores too often. Just keep that dirt sealed in, thank you very much. Even the very word clean was different back then. Sure, you might scrape off the visible mud and brush away the crusty bits from your tunic, but there's no bar of soap, no shampoo, no loofah in sight. The closest thing to a skincare routine involved maybe dabbing your face with rose water, if you were extremely fancy, or scrubbing with ashes and sand if you were a peasant. The dirt wasn't just on you, it was part of you. Let's not forget the animals. Chickens underfoot, pigs waddling through alleys, and oxen leaving fresh gifts on every corner. Waste management didn't exist. People threw their sewage, yes, raw, human waste, directly into the streets. That's not just some myth for drama's sake. You'd literally hear shouts of "Guard Loo" from upper windows, which loosely translates to "watch out for the toilet water." Moments later, a bucket of you-know-what would be dumped straight into the alley. And if you were unlucky enough to be walking by, congratulations, you're now part of the ecosystem, and it gets even more delightful. The streets themselves were often made of compressed dirt and straw soaked in all that refuse. Imagine summer, the sun beating down on these makeshift paths, warming up layers of decomposing filth, and creating a kind of low-grade biological weapon. Shoes weren't great either, usually leather flats with thin soles. You felt everything squishing underfoot. The real medieval experience was basically a daily fear factor challenge. Now here's a quirky fact. In some regions, people believed that strong body odour was actually a sign of health. You smelled like a working human, and that was a good thing. There were even cases where people deliberately avoided masking their scent with herbs or perfumes because they worried it would make them look vain. Or worse, sinful. In fact, too much effort toward cleanliness often got lumped in with pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. So you see a guy who's sparkling clean, he's probably up to something. There's actually an ongoing scholarly debate about just how dirty people truly were. Some historians argue that medieval folk weren't as disgustingly filthy as we love to think, that a lot of what we know comes from Victorian-era writers trying to make themselves feel superior. They claim there was some washing, some dental care, chewing on mint or sage to freshen breath, and a few scattered bathhouses that weren't all brothels. Others say that's just wishful thinking, and the truth is closer to the nose-wrinkling nightmare we imagine. Either way, the fact that the debate exists says a lot about how complex the topic is, and how much of it still lingers in our cultural nose memory. And the worst part? People got used to it. You adapt. Your nose goes blind. After a while, the ever-present stink isn't shocking, it's comforting. The familiar bouquet of village life. When a rare traveller arrived smelling of soap or herbs, people were just as likely to recoil as they were to admire. Cleanliness was alien, suspicious, possibly heretical. But let's rewind for a second and imagine. You're waking up in a modest medieval home. The air inside is thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, damp straw, last night's stew, and something vaguely mildewy. You open a wooden shutter, not a glass window, and breathe in a waft of whatever the neighbours tossed out their window that morning. Your own chamber pot needs emptying, and it's your turn. You carry it down the narrow stairs past the fire where the breakfast porridge is bubbling, probably with insects in it, and you step out into the street. You shout, "Garde-lou!" and hurl the contents into the alley. A goat bleats in the distance. Someone's yelling. The smell hits you again, and you shrug. It's just another day in the most pungent era in human history. You probably think baths are a basic human right, maybe even a ritual. A hot soak with bubbles, candles, maybe a little music. But in the Middle Ages, bathing was something you did so rarely it had to be marked on the calendar, and even then, only if it didn't raise eyebrows. You want to clean yourself? Great. But not too often, or people start wondering what you've been up to. Bathing wasn't just scarce, it was straight up controversial. In early medieval Europe, public and private baths were relatively common, leftovers from the Romans, who were obsessed with bathing. But as the centuries trudged on, that obsession curdled. By the 13th and 14th centuries, people had begun to see water as more of a threat than a blessing. The logic was weird, but it went like this. Opening your skin's pores through hot water made you more vulnerable to disease. In a world where plague and bad air were considered legitimate causes of death, that sounded like a hard pass. So, most folks opted out. Maybe they'd splash a little water on their face and hands before mass or dinner, out of social obligation, not because they wanted to feel refreshed. Real bathing, the full body kind, was reserved for very specific occasions, religious holidays, important life events like weddings, or actual medical treatment. Otherwise, you just marinated in your own oils and hoped no one noticed. Spoiler, they noticed. Even those lucky enough to have access to a tub often used it sparingly. A wooden bath barrel might be dragged in once or twice a year, filled with heated water by hand, bucket after bucket from a pot over the fire. Families reused the same water in turns, starting with the head of the household and working their way down the pecking order. By the time the youngest kid got in, the water was a sad, lukewarm soup of soap residue, skin flakes, and questionable floating matter. And yes, that's where the phrase "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater" allegedly comes from. The water was that murky. In wealthier homes, there were slightly more luxurious options. Portable wooden tubs lined with cloth, servants to fill and empty them, herbs and flower petals added to mask the funk. But even these setups were only used a few times a year. And in castles, bathing often meant being wheeled into the kitchen where it was warm and wet, and less of a fire hazard. Nothing screams royalty like sitting naked in a wooden tub while someone stirs stew a few feet away. Public bathhouses were a thing, but complicated. At first, they were just places to clean up. Men and women bathed together, and the vibe was casual. But it didn't stay that way. Bathhouses quickly became hotspots for gossip, gambling, and plenty of things the church frowned upon. If you were heading to the public baths too often, people started asking questions. Were you just there for the soap, or something steamier? In many towns, bathhouses were eventually shut down not for being unsanitary, but for being too fun. Quirky fact incoming. Some bathhouses actually served food and drink while you soaked. Imagine sitting in warm water, sipping wine and snacking on roast chicken, all while half-naked strangers float past. It sounds like a spa mixed with a medieval food court. Totally normal behaviour, apparently. Until the plague hit. Then it was like, wait, are we all just sharing germs and soup water? The idea of communal bathing tanked overnight, and so did any momentum toward routine cleanliness. There's an academic tug-of-war around this one too. Some scholars argue that medieval people did care about bathing, and that personal hygiene was more nuanced than we think. They point to bathhouse records, soap-making guilds, and even court documents discussing bathing etiquette. Others roll their eyes and point to the sheer amount of filth described in first-hand accounts, complaints from travellers, and laws literally banning people from tossing waste into the street, because it kept happening. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. Some bathed occasionally, most didn't, and everybody smelled weird. Of course, some folks were all in on filth, on purpose. There were monks and ascetics who believed that denying the body meant saving the soul. These were the people who thought not bathing at all was a form of devotion. Dirt was holy. Pain was cleansing. One famous monk supposedly bragged about not washing his feet for over 40 years, which is an achievement, sure, but not one you want to smell. Meanwhile, bathing as a luxury kept hanging around in certain circles. Knights, nobles, and even royalty sometimes threw bathing parties, with elaborate scented oils, music and servants standing by with towels. But again, these were events, statements, not routines. King Louis XIV of France, just barely out of the medieval era, was said to bathe only twice in his entire life. His physicians actually warned against water, fearing it would weaken him. Instead, they recommended linen shifts changed often to absorb bodily impurities, so kind of like a human paper towel system. And when people did bathe, it wasn't always for hygiene. Sometimes it was spiritual. Full-body immersion was used for religious purification, especially around Easter and other feast days. There were also ceremonial baths before marriage, which were less about cleanliness and more about symbolising a fresh start. Washing yourself meant washing your sins, your past, your old life, not your armpits. You, standing in that world, are maybe lucky enough to find a bathhouse still open in a mid-sized town. You walk in and find a steamy room filled with chattering voices, fogged glass windows if you're lucky, and the constant splash of wooden buckets. There's a strong scent of lavender and rosemary, meant to mask the human stew, but underneath it, you can still detect that core medieval musk. Someone nearby is having their back scrubbed with a coarse cloth. Another person dunks their head under a stream of water being poured from a pot. There's a fire blazing in the corner, and a worker is busy stoking it while sweat gleams on their forehead. For a second, it feels almost modern, almost civilized. Then you remember, you'll probably be wearing the same undergarments for another month. And when you finally step out, towel around your waist, your skin warm and clean for the first time in ages, someone looks at you sideways. Too clean. Suspiciously clean. Better watch that one. They probably read books too. So you've bathed, miraculously, and you're walking back to your home through a narrow medieval alley, the wooden buildings leaning so close you could probably steal someone's bread through their window if you were feeling bold. But your brief flirtation with cleanliness is about to be tested, because this isn't just a street, it's a toilet, a trash chute, and a general-purpose filth delivery system, all rolled into one. See, in medieval towns, plumbing wasn't a thing, at least not in the way you'd recognise. There were no underground sewers neatly tucked away beneath the pavement, no gleaming white porcelain to whisk your business away with a whoosh. No, if you had to go, you reached for your trusty chamber pot, a ceramic or wooden bowl tucked under the bed or in a quiet corner, and did your business. Simple, private, efficient, until it wasn't. Because now you've got a full chamber pot, and where does it go? Out the window, of course. The technique had a whole ritual to it. Before flinging a day's worth of bodily waste into the street, you were expected to shout something like "Garde l'eau!" from the French "Regardez l'eau," or "Watch out for the water," to warn any poor soul walking by. The problem was, not everyone bothered to shout, or they mumbled it, or they just didn't care. Which meant walking below windows was a high-stakes gamble every single day. People learned to hug walls and scurry quickly through alleys. The city wasn't just noisy and smelly, it was dangerous. Now picture this. You're wearing a hooded cloak, it's raining slightly, and as you pass beneath an upstairs window, a splash hits your shoulder. You freeze. You know exactly what just happened, but you don't scream, you don't even look up. You just keep walking, trying to convince yourself it was rain. Maybe it was, probably wasn't. You'll never know. Some wealthier homes had what were called garderobes, a sort of medieval indoor toilet, except the toilet part is generous. It was just a wooden seat with a hole, usually built into the outer wall of the house or castle, so the waste dropped directly down into a pit or, if you were lucky, a moat. So yes, moats weren't just for defence. They were also very literal crap-filled moats. Take a moment to appreciate that next time you see a fantasy castle in a movie. Castles also had murder holes, which, contrary to their name, weren't always for pouring boiling oil on invaders. Sometimes they were just architectural features that let guards or servants drop waste from upper levels into the world below. Efficiency, medieval style. And it wasn't just human waste. Everything went out the window. Spoiled food, dirty water, blood from slaughtered animals, ashes from the hearth. All of it landed in the same narrow alleyways and mingled into a fetid stew that soaked into the dirt roads. Add in the waste from roaming animals, pigs, dogs, horses and rats, and you've got the kind of environment that can only be described as biologically hostile. But here's the really fun twist. This was normal. Municipal governments, when they existed, tried to manage it. There were laws against dumping waste into the street, sure, but they were rarely enforced, and even when they were, it was like trying to put a band-aid on a volcano. A few towns did build public latrines or dung pits, but they quickly filled up and overflowed, and there was no real sanitation system to carry it away. So unless you were living near a river where you could at least toss things downstream and pretend it disappeared, you were stuck with the stink. Now let's not pretend everyone was just gross and lazy. People did try to keep their homes somewhat clean. Floors were often covered in rushes or straw to soak up messes, and those rushes were changed, occasionally, usually when they started to rot or attract too many insects. And by changed, we mean someone scooped up the top layer, pushed the rest to the side and threw some fresh straw over it. Problem solved. Smell neutralised. Sort of. A quirky detail here. Some upper-class households sprinkled herbs into the rushes on their floors, lavender, rosemary or chamomile, to help combat the odour. But really, that just turned the place into a medieval Glade plug-in, covering up the stench with a more polite stench. It was like putting a scented candle in a porta-potty. And the smells weren't just passive. They shaped how people lived. You didn't just smell the town, you navigated by it. You could tell if you were nearing the butcher, the tanner or the fishmonger long before you saw their signs. Your nose guided you like a GPS, warning you of particularly nasty intersections and alleys that doubled as open-air bathrooms. Children learned these olfactory landmarks early. It was part of growing up. There's actually an open scholarly debate about just how awful it really was. Some historians believe the descriptions we have come mostly from disgusted visitors, merchants, pilgrims or diplomats from cleaner regions who weren't used to the urban squalor. Others argue the townsfolk knew it was terrible and just didn't have the means to fix it. They even found records of neighbours suing each other over waste disputes, like, "Your privy overflows into my courtyard, and now my chickens are walking funny." Whatever the truth, one thing's certain. Medieval cities were an olfactory battlefield. And you? You're just trying to survive another stroll down Grope Lane or Shamble Street. Both real names, by the way. Some of which survive today. You breathe through your mouth, try not to step in anything too warm, and remind yourself that this was home for millions of people over hundreds of years. By the time you get back to your front door, your once clean self is already tainted. Mud spatters your hem, your boots are damp with mystery. You've picked up a new layer of scent, one that clings to your clothes like smoke from a fire. But there's no escaping it. This is just how life smells. And tonight, you'll fill your own chamber pot, slide it under the bed and try to sleep, knowing that somewhere above you, someone else is about to shout, "Gardaloo!" So let's keep walking. You're in the middle of a medieval city now, and it doesn't matter which one, London, Paris, Cologne or Florence, the scent hits the same. There's a reason even contemporary writers refer to these places as noisome, which is a fancy old way of saying, wow, this smells like a dead goat inside a burning outhouse. And it wasn't just bad, it was constant. From sunrise to sundown, the stink was baked into the very air, woven into the fog, clinging to your cloak. You didn't visit the medieval city with your nose, you survived it with grit and nasal resignation. The layout doesn't help. Streets are narrow and packed, sometimes no wider than an arm span. The upper stories of houses lean in toward each other, darkening the path below and trapping smells like a giant wooden lung with no exhale. There's no breeze down here. What rises from the gutters stays in the gutters. The buildings themselves are made of timber, plaster and thatch, materials that soak up moisture, mould, and the breath of everyone inside them. Wood in particular holds on to odours like it's collecting sins, and boy, are there plenty to choose from. People live elbow to elbow, whole families crammed into a single room, usually shared with their animals. Chickens wander freely, pigs root under the table, and if you're particularly lucky, you might get to share your straw bed with a goat in winter. Warm? Yes. Clean? Number. You're starting to understand the problem. It's not that medieval folks were dirtier than we are, it's that there was simply nowhere for the dirt to go. When everyone's living on top of each other, sanitation is less of a personal choice and more of an architectural tragedy. And let's talk about waste. Because it's not just in the chamber pots and gutters, it's everywhere. Butchers dump piles of offal, animal guts, bones, hooves, right outside their shops. Blood runs in little rivulets toward the centre of the road, where it mingles with slop and rainwater and forms what might generously be called a puddle. Bakers toss scorched bread, fishmongers scrape spoiled scales into the gutter, and tanners, dear God, the tanners, boil animal hides in vats of urine and lime, then slap the leftover sludge onto the street like it's nobody's business. Spoiler, it is everybody's business when it seeps into your shoes. The city stinks because it's alive, in the worst possible way. There are no garbage trucks, no sanitation crews, no hazmat suits. There's a vague concept of street sweeping, usually done by someone dragging a branch behind a cart, but it's more ceremonial than effective. It just smears the funk into new patterns, and don't even think about asking where all the animal carcasses go after they die in the streets. The answer is not far. But here's a quirky twist. Some cities tried to keep things semi-hygienic. In places like Paris, laws were passed that required people to clean the area in front of their homes once a week. Markets were technically supposed to dispose of waste at designated spots, but enforcement was spotty at best. Most officials were corrupt or busy, and the fines for dumping fish heads into the street were small potatoes compared to the effort of hauling them across town to a stinking refuse pile. Even rivers, those glorious natural drainage systems, weren't safe. The Thames, the Seine and the Rhine were all tapped out. Not just for drinking, but also for dumping. Human waste, slaughterhouse refuse, laundry runoff, and occasionally whole corpses all found their way into the water. The phrase "don't drink downstream" wasn't just common sense. It was a life-saving mantra. Waterborne illnesses like dysentery, cholera and typhoid were rampant. But since no one had microscopes, people just blamed the air, or sin, or their neighbour's weird-smelling stew. Which brings us to one of the most enduring debates among historians. Were medieval cities always this bad? Some argue that things weren't as bleak as we imagine, that medieval folks adapted to their environment, that the worst conditions only appeared during plagues or famine, and that smaller towns were often cleaner than major trade hubs. Others say that's wishful thinking, like romanticising a garbage dump because you once saw a bird land on it. The truth is probably a mix. Some neighbourhoods may have been better maintained, especially near cathedrals or wealthy homes, but most of the city, it reeked. In a way, smell was the ultimate class divider. The rich lived upwind, on hills, near fresh water or walled gardens. Their homes had higher windows, cleaner floors, and fewer pigs underfoot. The poor, they lived in the stink's front yard. If you were lucky, you had a thatch roof that only leaked some of the time and a dirt floor thick enough to plant onions in. Forget a backyard. Your view was the neighbour's outhouse, and your front stoop was the neighbourhood's unofficial dumping ground. And yet, somehow, people lived. Not just survived, but actually thrived. Markets bustled, bells rang. Children played hopscotch in the same streets that hosted fish guts hours earlier. The stink was part of the background noise, like traffic today. After a while, you just didn't notice it. People developed what we'd now call olfactory fatigue. Your nose gets tired and stops noticing. Which, if you think about it, is probably the only reason medieval life was psychologically bearable. Picture yourself walking into a crowded tavern now. You open the heavy wooden door and get hit with a wave of heat, sweat, smoke, ale and roast meat. It's like breathing through a damp wool sock. You push your way through the crowd. Someone's singing, someone else is vomiting quietly in the corner. A dog is licking up scraps under the table. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed humans and a faint undertone of mildew. But this is comfort. This is normal. And everyone around you is smiling. You sit down, order a cup of something vaguely alcoholic and raise your mug with the others. Somewhere a lute starts playing off-key. The stench is part of the soundtrack now, a character in its own right. Not invited, but never leaving. Now let's narrow things down to a single unfortunate body part, your mouth. Because if you think medieval streets were rough, just wait until you get a whiff of medieval breath. Dental hygiene in the Middle Ages was a strange cocktail of superstition, desperation, and sheer neglect. If eyes are the window to the soul, then mouths were more like the open sewer grates of the face. Teeth were expected to rot. It wasn't if, it was when. By the time someone reached their late 20s or 30s, they were often already missing a few. Blackened molars, crumbling incisors, inflamed gums. It was basically a dental horror film playing in slow motion inside every mouth. Cavities weren't treated, they were endured. If a tooth hurt badly enough, you yanked it. Or more accurately, someone yanked it. possibly using tongs, maybe without warning, and almost certainly without any anaesthetic. You just gripped the chair, screamed into a cloth, and hoped you didn't faint from the pain, or the infection that followed. But what really haunts you is the breath. Medieval breath was the kind of thing that could peel paint off a monastery wall. People weren't brushing their teeth with minty toothpaste twice a day. There were no flossing routines, no tongue scrapers, no emergency packs of gum in their purse. If you wanted to freshen up, you might chew on a twig, literally. Certain types of twigs, like those from the neem or miswak tree, have natural antibacterial properties and were used like primitive toothbrushes. People would gnaw one end into fibres and rub their teeth with it. Surprisingly effective in some ways, but still miles away from modern dental care. Some folks rubbed ashes, salt, or crushed herbs on their teeth. Sounds promising until you realise that grit wears enamel down like sandpaper. Combine that with a diet heavy on coarse bread, tough meat, and dried legumes, and your teeth had a life expectancy shorter than most medieval kings. Speaking of diet, let's get into it. Because what you eat plays a big role in how your breath smells. Medieval Europeans loved onions, garlic, leeks, and cured meats. That's a lot of sulphur. Add in mead, ale, and the occasional hunk of blue-veined cheese, and you're basically building a mouth that smells like a compost heap set on fire. And remember, no refrigeration. Spoilage was common. If something was a little off, you just salted it, stewed it, or doused it in vinegar. Problem solved. For your stomach, maybe. For your breath. Not even close. What's more disturbing is how breath was tied to medicine. In the humoral system, which guided medieval medical theory, doctors believed your breath reflected the balance of your bodily fluids. A foul smell might indicate an excess of black bile or a liver crisis. They'd try to fix you with bloodletting, purgatives, or bizarre mouthwashes made from wine, honey, and herbs. One such mixture involved boiling sage in vinegar and using it to rinse your mouth. Not terrible in theory, but when the alternative is pulling teeth with pliers made for horses, it's your best-case scenario. Quirky fact for tonight. In certain circles, mouth charms were a thing. These were little spells or prayers people would recite while holding specific herbs to supposedly drive away tooth pain and, bonus, smelly breath. You might whisper a Latin phrase while clutching a clove, or sleep with a tiny sachet of rosemary tied around your neck. It was like medieval aromatherapy meets desperate superstition. Did it work? Emotionally, maybe? Olfactorily? Absolutely not. There's an ongoing debate among historians about how bad medieval dental health actually was. Some point to skeletal remains with surprisingly intact teeth, arguing that lower sugar intake helped keep decay at bay. After all, they didn't have soda, candy, or caramel fraps. Others argue that any benefit from diet was cancelled out by poor hygiene and rough food. Grinding grain with stone tools often left tiny bits of grit in bread, which basically turned every bite into a dental sandblaster. That'll wear down enamel real quick. And if you were unlucky enough to develop an abscess, one of those swollen, painful infections under the tooth, you either suffered in silence or went to a barber surgeon. Not a dentist. There were no dentists yet. You sat down, tilted your head back, and hoped the man wielding the metal hook had a steady hand and didn't just come from hacking off someone else's infected foot. By the way, kissing in medieval Europe. Not as cute as you think. People did kiss, on the cheeks, the hands, and yes, occasionally on the lips, but it wasn't romantic in the modern sense. Courtly love was full of rules and idealization. Real mouth-to-mouth kissing was rare, especially between strangers. Probably because, let's be honest, it was a full sensory experience in the worst possible way. Imagine leaning in, only to be greeted by a wave of mead breath and visible tartar build-up. That's not sparks flying. That's your soul leaving your body. And yet, just like the general stench of the city, people got used to it. Your breath wasn't judged unless it was extra offensive, like knock a monk out kind of offensive. People weren't walking around doing breath checks. They were too busy not dying from infected wounds and crop failures to worry if your teeth smelled like fermented goat stew. You in this time are doing your best. Maybe you chew a sprig of parsley after dinner, or rinse with a bitter herbal concoction, but your teeth are already worn down. One molar is starting to ache, and you've been ignoring it, hoping it goes away. It won't. Eventually someone's going to yank it, and your breath, somehow, will only get worse after the gaping wound is left to fester in the cool medieval air. Tonight, you lie down on your straw mattress, mouth dry from the smoky air and mead, breath so thick you could slice it, and you think, Maybe tomorrow you'll find some mint, or maybe not. Because honestly, what's the point? You've got bigger things to worry about, like not catching the plague, or getting peed on from a second-story window. Let's talk class. Because while everyone in the Middle Ages shared the same general aroma of suffering, there were definitely levels to the stink. Peasants and nobles might have both smelled like they fought a mud wrestling match with a dead sheep, but how they got there was a whole different journey, and weirdly enough, the lower classes often came out of it a little less gross, at least when it came to actual hygiene. Don't be too shocked. Picture yourself as a peasant. You live in a rural village, maybe an hour's walk from the nearest town. Your house is one room, built of wattle and daub, with a thatched roof that leaks if a bird so much as looks at it wrong. Your floor is dirt, your bed is straw, your air is smoke from the fire pit in the middle of the room, because chimneys are still some fancy newfangled idea for rich people, and yet, somehow, you might actually be cleaner than a noble living in a massive stone castle. Why? Because you've got access to something magical, a river. Peasants bathed in streams or ponds, often as part of their daily routine. Washing yourself wasn't fancy or ceremonial, it was just practical. After a hard day digging fields, you'd strip off your grime-caked tunic and splash around in the cold water. Sure, you weren't using organic lavender body wash or exfoliating with sea salt, but at least you were rinsing off the sweat and mud. It was free, refreshing, and nobody was going to lecture you about opening your pores to the devil. Clothes got washed too, sometimes. Women would lug garments to the riverbank, beat them on rocks, scrub them with lye or ashes, and hang them to dry in the sun. Was the process rough on fabric? Absolutely. Clothes didn't last long, and most people only owned 1 or 2 sets anyway, but it beat walking around in mouldy wool. Now contrast that with the noble class. If you're born into money, you live in a castle or manor. Beautiful on the outside, but practically a stone refrigerator on the inside. It's cold, drafty, and damp. The stone walls sweat moisture. Mould grows in the corners. The only warmth comes from a fire that fills the rooms with a haze of smoke, and the faint odour of charred rat droppings. You think you'd be cleaner because you're rich? Not so fast. Nobles didn't do their own washing. Their clothes were made of fine, delicate fabrics, velvet, silk, brocade, and cleaning them was risky. So, instead of washing them, they perfumed them. That's right. If a noble's gown started to reek like sour wine and body grease, they'd just douse it in rosewater and call it a day. Over time, the layers of perfume and filth created something like scented armour. Aromatic from a distance, horrifying up close. And bathing? Nobles did it, but again, rarely. It was a production. They needed servants to haul buckets of water, heat them over a fire, fill a wooden tub in a private chamber, then add herbs and petals for fragrance. It could take hours, so they mostly relied on linen shifts worn close to the skin. The theory was that the linen would draw out the dirt and oils, absorbing them so the skin could stay clean. It didn't work, but hey, linen was cheaper than self-awareness. The result? A noble might go months without touching actual water. When you peeled off their layers, it wasn't so much undressing as archaeological excavation. And the worst offenders were sometimes the most powerful people. Royals were practically allergic to soap. Some rulers, like Queen Isabella of Castile, were said to have only bathed twice in their entire lives, which, while possibly exaggerated, gives you an idea of the era's cleanliness standards for the elite. Quirky fact, some nobles had personal scent assistants. These were servants responsible for maintaining their master's aromatic aura, freshening up their linens with perfumes, holding sachets of herbs under their noses, and even discreetly waving fans to keep their body odour from building into a visible fog. If you're imagining a medieval hype man with a bag of lavender, you're not far off. Of course, all of this filth disguised as finery created a strange kind of social dynamic. Nobles believed their status made them immune to common dirt, both literal and moral. If a peasant stank, it was because they were coarse and lowborn. If a noble stank, it was just the scent of importance. They'd be dripping sweat in velvet robes, their hair greasy under heavy hats, their breath a cocktail of rotten wine, and no one would dare say a word. Not unless they wanted to get tossed in a dungeon, or worse, invited to court. Meanwhile, the peasants were out in the fields, sweating it out under the sun, washing in cold rivers, changing into their one spare tunic, and sleeping next to their goats for warmth. They didn't smell great, but at least their filth was honest, functional. No one was pretending the hay-scented guy with muddy boots was a model of virtue. He was just trying to make it to next Tuesday without dying of exposure or crop failure. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether the noble classes actually cared about being clean, or if they just had a different definition of it. Some argue that wealthier folks did value hygiene, just not in the ways we recognise, like the use of scented oils and elaborate grooming rituals. Others say it was all smoke and mirrors, literally, that nobles wrapped themselves in perfume clouds and stiff lace as a way to mask the rot beneath. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. They wanted to be clean, they just had no clue how. So imagine yourself in that world, straddling the line between class and cleanliness. You've just helped your neighbour wash her linens by the river, your hands red from the cold water. You return to the village and pass a noble caravan heading through town. The air shifts, cloaks billow, perfumes mix with horse sweat and old wine. You breathe in and realise something. Underneath all the fancy spices and silks, they stink just as much as you do. Maybe worse. And that's the dirty secret of medieval life. Status didn't save you from the stink. If anything, it just gave it fancier shoes. Religion, in the Middle Ages, wasn't just a Sunday obligation. It was the atmosphere. It filled the churches, the bells, the laws, and even the smells. Yes, believe it or not, religion had a scent. And it wasn't always the comforting aroma of incense wafting through a quiet cathedral. No, it was a mixed bag of burning herbs, wax, mouldy stone, rotting relics, and the combined breath of a dozen fasting monks in an unventilated chapel. Heavenly? Not exactly. Let's step inside a medieval church. The first thing you notice isn't the stained glass or the towering arches. It's the air. Heavy. Thick. It smells like damp stone and candle smoke, with a faint undercurrent of old wood and dust that's probably older than your bloodline. If it's a special holy day, they're burning incense, frankincense, myrrh, or something slightly more budget-friendly like dried herbs. It fills your lungs, coats your tongue, and clings to your clothes. It's a smell you associate with salvation, but also somehow mildew. That incense wasn't just for vibes, it had a purpose. Medieval people didn't bathe much, remember, so church services could get, let's say, ripe. Dozens or even hundreds of unwashed bodies packed into a stone room with no windows and no airflow. Something had to be done. So priests swung censers filled with smoking resins through the aisles, masking the BO with holy smoke. It became symbolic, the scent of prayer rising to heaven. But really it was divine deodorant in action. And then there were the relics. Oh boy. Every church wanted a piece of the sacred, bone fragments of saints, locks of hair from martyrs, bits of cloth soaked in holy blood. But here's the problem. Some of those relics weren't exactly well preserved. In fact, a lot of them were straight up rotting in their display cases. That miraculous odour some pilgrims reported smelling when they visited a relic shrine, there's a chance it was less divine intervention, and more the slow decay of a 200-year-old kneecap. People lined up to kiss these things. They'd press their lips to glass coffins, silver reliquaries, or splinters of wood supposedly from the true cross. You, standing in that line, are holding a candle and trying very hard not to gag. You're here to receive a blessing, not a bacterial infection, but the air tells a different story. It's musky, humid, and somehow carries both hope and mildew. Monasteries were no better. You'd think places of spiritual reflection would be clean, peaceful sanctuaries. But monasteries were workhouses. Monks spent their days copying manuscripts, brewing ale, farming, feeding the poor, and crucially, not bathing. In some orders, cleanliness was considered vanity. Dirt was humility. A bit of crust in your hair, a sign of spiritual discipline. One monk reportedly wore the same habit for 25 years without washing it. You can practically hear the lice applauding. Now imagine their dormitories. Rows of beds packed into long, narrow rooms, each one just a straw mattress on a wooden board. No blankets unless it was winter. No personal space. And absolutely no regular linen washing. The smell? A blend of sweat, feet, damp wool, old books, and sanctity. You crawl into your assigned spot, trying not to inhale too deeply. You're here to get closer to God, but right now, you're closer to the monk beside you, and his breath smells like pickled onions and silent judgment. The kitchen isn't much better. Meals are simple. Gruel, stale bread, cabbage stew. but the aroma of overcooked root vegetables clings to the walls like regret. Without modern ventilation, every room in the monastery eventually smells like whatever was served 3 weeks ago, and meat? Only allowed on certain feast days, but when it's on the menu it comes with the full fanfare of medieval butchery, blood, bone, and the kind of funk that gets into your sinuses and never leaves. There's also a theological funk at play. Cleanliness was tied directly to morality. The soul was what mattered. The body was just a temporary sin-prone sack of meat. Washing it too much was seen as prideful, indulgent, dangerous even. Why cleanse the flesh when it was the spirit that needed purifying? Better to spend your energy praying, fasting, flagellating, or walking barefoot to a shrine halfway across the continent. And yet there was contradiction. Monks might refuse to bathe, but they'd spend hours scrubbing the altar with fragrant oils. They might live in filth, but obsess over the ritual cleanliness of their vestments. Some churches burned herbs not just for scent, but to purify the air, believing that smoke could drive away demons or disease. It was a spiritual Febreze with high stakes. Here's a quirky bit of trivia. Some saints were believed to emit a sweet, unearthly fragrance even after death. It was called the odour of sanctity. It meant their body wasn't rotting like a common sinner's. It was preserved by divine grace. Pilgrims would travel for miles just to smell a saint's tomb. Whether they were catching a whiff of miracle or just decomposing fabric is anyone's guess. Modern scholars debate just how pervasive the stench of religion really was. Some argue that the use of incense and ritual cleansing suggests a higher awareness of hygiene in religious settings than we give credit for. Others say that's a very generous reading of burn some herbs and hope for the best. The truth is probably both. There was some awareness, but not enough to cancel out the full sensory assault of hundreds of fasting monks in wool robes. You, weary pilgrim, are now kneeling at the altar. A thin mist of incense floats in the air. You're surrounded by silence and the scent of melted wax. Behind you, someone sneezes wetly. You try to focus on the divine, but it's hard when your eyes are watering and you can taste the stone mould on the back of your tongue. Afterward, you light a candle, drop a coin into the alms box, and file out with the rest of the faithful. You're spiritually uplifted. Physically, you reek of smoke, sweat, and a hint of dried fish from the monastery kitchen, which is fine, because back in your village, that smell means something. It means you've been somewhere holy. Just maybe crack a window on the ride home. Let's talk bathhouses. Those rare, steamy, slightly scandalous little bubbles of cleanliness in an otherwise filthy world. At first glance, they seem like a no-brainer. People need to wash, right? A public place with hot water, soap, and someone willing to scrub your back. That sounds downright civilized for the Middle Ages. But here's the twist. Bathhouses weren't just about hygiene. They were also dens of sin, gossip, and social awkwardness wrapped in steam and naked strangers. Cleanliness may have been next to godliness, but only until the priest walked in and shut the whole thing down. Imagine you're in a medieval town and you hear the word stew. You might think of soup. Wrong. In Middle English, stew was slang for a bathhouse, and stepping into one was an experience. You're immediately hit with the humid breath of boiling water, the scent of rosemary floating in the air, and the overlapping murmur of voices. Everyone's half-dressed or totally naked, sweating through the fog. You can barely see across the room. Somewhere, someone's pouring wine. In the back, 2 people are laughing a little too intimately. Yeah, this isn't just a place to rinse your feet. Bathhouses were communal. Men and women bathed together, at least in the early part of the Middle Ages. No dividers, no privacy curtains, just skin, soap, and maybe a lute player in the corner to class things up. It was a social event. You'd eat, drink, and bathe all in one go. Business meetings happened here. So did matchmaking. And yes, plenty of other things that made the church nervous. Some bathhouses started offering extra services. Let's call them spiritual massages with air quotes. Prostitutes worked in the stews, often openly. You might go in for a back scrub and end up booking an entirely different kind of session. Suddenly, bathhouses weren't just about washing your body. They were about indulgence, pleasure, the mixing of class, gender, and morality. All things that made the authorities sweat harder than anyone actually in the bath. But for a while, they flourished. Cities like Paris, London, and Prague had dozens of stews operating at once. Bathhouses advertised with colourful signs, and sometimes even live musicians out front. The interiors range from simple wooden tubs to elaborate tiled rooms with heated floors and running water. If you had coin, you could live like a soap-slicked emperor for an hour. And the soap itself? Made from animal fats and ashes, often mixed with herbs to disguise the smell. It worked. Okay, you wouldn't come out smelling like a field of daisies, but at least you'd be less crusty than you went in. Attendants would scrape dead skin with rough cloths or tools and massage oil into your scalp. Some places even offered tooth-cleaning services, primitive scrubs made with vinegar and salt. Quirky fact: in some towns, bathhouses had posted rules. No fighting, no gambling, no loud singing, and in one case no excessive splashing. Which raises questions. How much splashing was considered excessive? Was there a bathhouse splash referee? Probably not, but we'd like to imagine one, towel around his neck, scowling into the steam. But of course the dream couldn't last. By the 14th century the tone started to shift. The Black Death hit. Suddenly, anything involving public gatherings, naked bodies and water became suspicious. Bathhouses, once symbols of social life and basic hygiene, were blamed for spreading disease. People feared that the hot water opened the skin, letting in corrupted air, miasma, that carried plague, which ironically meant that getting clean was now seen as dangerous. On top of that, the church really ramped up its moral crackdown. Bathhouses had become, in their eyes, glorified brothels. Sins of the flesh were bad enough when done in secret. Imagine encouraging them with warm water and candlelight. Sermons began targeting the stews. Moral panic spread faster than lice in a monastery. Laws were passed. Closures followed. In London, the stews in Suffolk were officially shut down in 1546 by King Henry VIII, not because of disease, but because of their unrepentant sinfulness. If the soap didn't wash your soul, out you went. There's a scholarly debate about whether shutting down bathhouses really helped anything. Some historians argue that it pushed people into filthier habits, cutting off one of the few chances the average person had to actually scrub their body. Others believe it was a necessary public health move, even if the science behind it was wildly inaccurate. Either way, once bathhouses disappeared, personal hygiene took another nosedive, right into a pile of unwashed laundry and lice-infested bedding. You, wandering through this period, might stumble on one of the last stews still in operation. It's discreet now, half hidden behind a curtain in a back alley. Inside, a single tub waits, steam rising slowly, candles flickering low. You pay a few coins. Someone hands you a cloth and tells you not to linger. You wash, quickly, feeling the heat loosen your joints and the grime of the week slide off your skin. For a brief, glorious moment, you remember what it's like to not itch, not stink, not feel like your skin's made of barn dust and goat oil. But then the door creaks open. A city official, or maybe a priest, someone important. The bathkeeper goes pale. You get out fast, drying off with a towel that smells like old stew. Outside, the wind hits you, and you're already starting to cool, the warmth fading. You smell like soap and fear. Later, you hear the bathhouse was shut down. Unholy activities, they said. Unclean practices. You roll your eyes. You were just trying to rinse the plague off your elbows, not commit a cardinal sin. But whatever. Back to sponge baths with rainwater and shame. And thus, one of the few places where people actually tried to not reek like decay and desperation is lost to time. Hygiene once again becomes a luxury of the bold and the heretical. Enjoy your dry pits while they last. So let's say you're rich, filthy rich. You've got a castle, a retinue of servants, a wardrobe that requires scaffolding to wear, and a name long enough to need a footnote. Congratulations. But before you get too smug, just know this. You still smell. Possibly even worse than the peasants you wouldn't dare make eye contact with. And because you're rich, you get to participate in one of the more tragically ineffective trends in medieval hygiene, scented accessories. The medieval version of just spray more cologne was the pomander, and buddy, people clung to it like it could stop the apocalypse. Pomanders were little balls made of gold, silver or carved wood, filled with aromatic substances, herbs, spices, crushed flowers, maybe some ambergris if you had cash to burn. They were strung on chains or tucked into belts, or even hidden in the folds of those elaborate robes nobles insisted on wearing in all weather. Think of it like a medieval AirPod case, except instead of holding earbuds, it holds your last line of defence against someone else's armpits. You, a well-dressed courtier, Might be walking through the crowded halls of a palace or banquet hall. Every third person smells like they've been locked in a meat cellar since spring. You subtly raise your pomander to your nose, pretending to cough, when really you're just trying to survive the stench of Duke so-and-so's unwashed armour and garlic breath. The relief is brief, just a puff of clove and cinnamon, then it's gone, like a ghost of hygiene. Pomanders weren't just fancy nose holders, they were believed to protect you from disease. This is where the science gets delightfully weird. The prevailing theory at the time was that bad smells, miasmas, caused illness. So if the air was foul, it could corrupt your humours and lead to plague, fever, or worse. Covering your nose with something pleasant wasn't just for comfort, it was survival. Smell something bad, and your life might be at risk. Smell something good? You just bought yourself a few more weeks of not dying. But it wasn't just pomanders. There was a whole industry of medieval scent strategy. You had sachets of herbs sewn into clothes, dried flowers stuffed into mattress seams, rosewater sprinkled on linen and perfumed gloves. Yes, gloves that reeked of imported oils, musk and citrus. Some nobles even carried little sponges soaked in vinegar and rose oil to press against their faces when the streets got unbearable. You might be choking on sewer steam, but at least your gloves smell like Sicily. And here's the kicker. All this perfume didn't make people cleaner. It just made them smell confusing. The funk didn't go away. It just wrestled with lavender until one scent pinned the other. You end up with this bizarre olfactory layering of body odour, old fabric, wood smoke, rotting teeth, and then, bam, jasmine, or cloves, or violets mashed into animal fat and smeared behind someone's ears. It's less clean and more what just died in a flower cart. One of the more fascinating and slightly grotesque quirks of the time was the use of ambergris, basically whale vomit that had been aged, hardened and powdered. It was rare and insanely expensive, but prized for its sweet, earthy scent. You'd find it in everything from pomanders to soaps to perfumes meant for royalty. So yes, you might be rich, but part of your refined scent comes courtesy of semi-digested squid from a sperm whale. Medieval luxury is a weird place, but let's be honest. Most people couldn't afford any of this. If you were middle class or below, your scent masking options were limited to maybe a sprig of mint in your hat, or a satchel of dried rosemary sewn into your belt. Occasionally you might crush some herbs in your hands and rub them on your neck. Instant medieval cologne, guaranteed to hold up for a solid 20 minutes before your natural musk reasserted dominance. And it wasn't just personal use. Whole rooms were scented. In castles, bundles of dried herbs, called strewing herbs, were scattered across the floors. Every step released a puff of aroma which helped counteract the not-so-pleasant side effect of having no toilets, and a steady stream of visitors tracking in goat manure. In theory, it created a fragrant environment. In reality, it was more like an herbal distraction from the war crimes your nose was enduring. Now here's where it gets really absurd. During plague outbreaks, doctors wore those infamous bird beak masks. Yes, the ones that look like a goth toucan auditioning for a death metal band. The long nose was stuffed with herbs, spices and dried flowers. Why? Same logic as the pomander. Keep the bad smells out and maybe you won't get sick. Did it work? Not at all. But it looked fantastic on Instagram if they had it, which they didn't, but still. There's a lively academic debate about just how widespread pomander use was. Some historians argue it was limited to the elite, while others believe the practice trickled down to wealthier merchants and even some urban workers. There's evidence of scent balls and herbal sachets found in burial sites across Europe. Maybe they believed even the dead preferred to smell like cinnamon rather than corpse. Can't blame them. You, our fragrant little time traveller, are heading to court today. Your finest tunic is brushed, your shoes polished, and tucked into your sleeve is a silver pomander filled with a mix of rosemary, cloves, and dried rose petals. You pass through the gates into a crowded hall where everyone is shouting, drinking, and fanning themselves against the stifling heat. The smell hits immediately, a musky blend of sweat, meat, mildew, and desperation. You hold your pomander to your nose and breathe in. It's not much, but it's something. As you approach your patron, you offer a deep bow, pomander discreetly lowered. They smell even worse up close, like wine-soaked wool and ancient cheese. But you smile through it. Politics, after all, is about endurance. And in this era, that means surviving someone else's perfume-drenched body odour for as long as necessary. At the end of the day, you're home again, hanging your pouch by the door. You sniff it once more. Just a faint ghost of lavender remains. Tomorrow you'll refill it. Maybe try some sage this time. Because in a world where nobody really bathes, you take your victories where you can. One clove-scented inhale at a time. By now you've probably figured out that medieval folks had a lot working against them in the smell department. But if there's one thing guaranteed to take already questionable hygiene and drop-kick it straight into the nosebleed section, it's the food. Not the elegant banquet-style medieval feast Hollywood likes to sell you. The roasted swan and sugar sculptures and velvet goblets of wine. Nah, we're talking about what the average person ate. What it did to their body, and what their body in turn did to everyone else's personal space. Let's start with the basics. You're a regular villager. Your diet consists of whatever you can grow, steal, trade, or beg. Mostly that means bread. Barley bread, rye bread, oat bread. If you're lucky, wheat bread. But that's usually reserved for the rich, so you're probably not that lucky. This bread is hard, dense. It's got chunks of ground-up husk, a few stray pebbles from the millstone, and a smell that's a mix of sour yeast and slight despair. It fills you up, but your teeth will be begging for mercy by the time you're 30. Next on the menu, onions, garlic, leeks, cheap, easy to grow, and flavourful in that eye-watering, breath-destroying way. Vegetables, when available, are boiled until they resemble soggy fabric, then tossed into a pottage, a sort of edible swamp made from whatever grains and legumes haven't gone mouldy. Occasionally you'll get a piece of dried or salted meat. It smells like old leather and chews like it too. Fresh meat is a rare luxury, and when you do get it, it's usually goat or mutton that's been hanging a little too long. So now you're walking around with a gut full of hard bread, boiled cabbage, and half-fermented cheese. Your body, predictably, does not appreciate this. Gas is common. Like, extremely common. People walk around farting constantly and no one even flinches. If someone lifts a leg to one side while having a casual conversation, that's just daily life. You just make sure to step upwind. To make things worse, most people drink ale, not because they're all party animals, but because the water might kill them. With no reliable filtration, rivers and wells are often contaminated, so beer, low alcohol, cheap and boiled during brewing, is the safest option. You drink it from sun-up to sundown. It fills your belly, blurs your mind, and adds a yeasty funk to your breath and sweat that never quite fades. On feast days, you might get wine if you're noble, but that's usually sour and cut with herbs, honey, or even chalk to stretch it further. And yes, it smells exactly how you'd expect medieval wine with chalk in it to smell, like regret. Now let's talk about digestion. You know that feeling when you eat too much dairy and your body sends out a passive-aggressive warning text from your lower intestine? That was basically daily life in the Middle Ages. With diets high in hard-to-digest grains, spoiled fats and undercooked pulses, bloating and gastrointestinal distress were the norm. Combine that with very little understanding of nutrition, and everyone was either constipated or dealing with what was poetically called flux. If you had diarrhea, you chalked it up to bad humours or a cursed turnip. Either way, you didn't stop eating the same thing tomorrow. This diet didn't just mess with your internal plumbing, it shaped your scent. Think about it. Garlic oozing from your pores, breath that smells like pickled turnips and beer, clothes steeped in sweat from a protein-deficient body trying to haul hay all day. Your body odour isn't just human musk, it's fermented peasant stew served hot and fresh. Now, if you're a noble, the food situation is different, but not necessarily better. You've got access to more meat, more sugar, more spices, and somehow even worse breath. Sugar starts entering the European diet during the later Middle Ages, and nobles snap it up like medieval toddlers at a cake buffet. They're chewing candied fruit, sugar-coated almonds, and pastries glazed in syrup. Taste amazing, destroys teeth. Rotten gums, exposed roots, infected molars. Your breath becomes a medieval weapon. And spices? Oh, they love spices. Clove, cinnamon, pepper, saffron, imported at enormous cost from Asia or the Middle East. But these aren't just for flavour. They're for covering up the taste of questionable meat. If you've ever smelled meat that's about 4 days past its death certificate but still technically on the plate, imagine that with a splash of cinnamon and a prayer. That's noble cuisine. There's an ongoing debate among historians about how much of this was truly unbearable. Some say the diet was actually more balanced than we give credit for, especially in rural areas. where access to fresh produce and dairy was better. Others argue the overwhelming reliance on preserved foods, bad water, and sheer culinary monotony made for some spectacularly funky humans. The answer probably depends on location, class, and how desperate you were during the last harvest. Here's a quirky historical side note. During courtship, people might give each other breath-freshening gifts, little cones of sugar with mint or small fruit chews laced with anise. Nothing says romance like, "Hey, I like you, but your mouth smells like cabbage left in the sun." You, in this fragrant era, finish your daily meal, pottage and barley bread with a garlic chaser, then wipe your mouth with the back of your sleeve and belch like a satisfied beast. No one looks up. It's expected. You reach for your ale, take a swig, and consider the lingering note of unwashed mug mixed with whatever animal lived in it last week. Later, as you gather with others in the village square, the smell of bodies mingles with whatever the wind blew in from the tannery and the pig pens. You breathe it in like it's air, because it is air. This is your ecosystem now. Everything you eat becomes part of your scent, and your scent joins the chorus of smells that define your home, your people, your age. You don't notice it anymore. Not really, but a visitor might. A traveller from another land or another time would step into this moment, inhale once and promptly pass out. You just yawn and wonder if there's any garlic left for tomorrow. Let's have a quiet moment now for something that rarely got one in the Middle Ages. Laundry. Washing clothes in this era wasn't a weekly chore or a relaxing Saturday ritual. It was a physical, punishing ordeal that people avoided as long as human dignity or marriage prospects allowed. Your shirt. You wore it until it begged for death. Your undergarments. Well, assuming you owned more than one pair, you might rotate them between washings that occurred somewhere between the full moons and divine intervention. Imagine your daily outfit. It's made of wool or linen, thick, coarse, heavy, not exactly breathable. By midday it's soaked in sweat. By nightfall it's taken on the scent of fire smoke, onions, animal grease, and whatever your neighbour dumped in the street that morning. And yet, it's still your best tunic. You sleep in it. You work in it. You might even be buried in it, depending on how things go. Washing this garment is not as simple as tossing it in a machine and catching up on your reading. No, medieval laundry involves dragging your reeking clothes to the nearest water source, usually a river, maybe a communal well. You scrub it with ash or lye, a harsh and caustic solution that might dissolve stains, or your fingers, or both. Then you beat the fabric against rocks or heavy wooden paddles, trying to convince the dirt and sweat to let go. Spoiler, it often doesn't. If you're lucky, there's sun to dry your clothes. If you're really lucky, no birds drop anything on them while they hang. But more often, drying is done indoors, draped over smoky rafters or laid near the hearth, which just bakes the sweat back in with a hint of wood ash. So yes, clean clothes were technically cleaner, but they also smelled like someone barbecued a goat in them. And did we mention shrinkage? Fabric back then wasn't pre-shrunk or treated. It warped in unpredictable ways. Wash it once, and suddenly your perfectly fitted tunic now clings like a sausage casing or droops like a wizard's robe. Buttons pop off, seams pull, so a lot of people just didn't bother. They'd brush off visible dirt, maybe beat the dust out with a stick, and carry on like nothing happened. Undergarments were, in theory, the most frequently washed items, usually linen shifts or chemises worn close to the skin to absorb sweat and body oil. These were thin, white and fragile, so people did try to clean them more often. But more often still meant once a month, give or take a festival, and that's if you owned more than one. Many peasants wore their shift every day, and only removed it when it became so stiff it could walk to the river by itself. Now, for wealthier households, laundry was delegated. You didn't wash your own linen, you had a laundress for that. But don't picture some dainty servant girl with a lacy bonnet humming while she rinses your collars. No, this was back-breaking, skin-chapping labour. Laundresses stood in icy rivers up to their knees, scrubbing and wringing and hauling baskets of wet fabric that weighed more than most toddlers. Their hands were raw, their backs permanently bent, and they got paid in crumbs and blisters. In towns, there were public washhouses, or lavoirs, where women gathered to do laundry communally. You'd hear singing, gossip, the rhythmic slap of cloth against stone, and occasionally full-blown arguments. Laundry wasn't just work, it was social, but it was also risky. The river water wasn't exactly clean, and in some places doing laundry upstream from a tannery was a death sentence for your fabric, and possibly your health. And if your clothes couldn't be washed, you perfumed them. You stuffed the sleeves with dried lavender or mint, sprinkled rosewater on the collar, or smoked them over a fire with burning herbs. It didn't clean anything. It just distracted the nose for 5 to 7 seconds. Some people even layered extra garments on top of their filthiest pieces, so the visible layer looked clean. It's the medieval version of wearing a blazer to hide the fact that you haven't done laundry since Lent. Quirky detail time. Some people actually owned scented shirts. These were undergarments dyed with herbs and oils, intended to emit a faint fragrance as the body heated up. The idea was that as you sweat, which you absolutely would, the smell would be masked by the pleasant aroma of sage or violet. Great theory. In practice, you just ended up smelling like sweaty sage, which, if you've ever gardened in August, you know is not an improvement. There's a scholarly debate about how widespread laundry really was among different classes. Some argue that even the poorest folks tried to keep their undergarments as clean as possible, because they believed cleanliness could prevent disease. Others say the rarity of linen ownership and the sheer difficulty of laundering meant most people were walking around in dirty clothes most of the time, regardless of intention. The records are patchy, the smells? Not so much. You today are facing laundry day. It's been 3 weeks since your last wash, and your shift now has its own opinion on politics. You drag your garments to the river, scrubbing them until your knuckles bleed, then wring them out until your arms shake. By the time you're done, you've washed 3 pieces of clothing, lost circulation in your hands, and caught a cold from standing in freezing water for hours. Later, as you hang your shift by the hearth and watch smoke curl through its fibres, you feel a moment of pride. It's not exactly clean. It still has a faint crust of mystery around the hem, but it's cleaner than yesterday, and that, in medieval terms, is as good as new. Tomorrow you'll put it back on, wear it under layers of wool and leather, and pretend you don't smell like smoked onions and mould, because no one else is doing better. And if someone is, well, they're probably a noble who hasn't washed their undershirt in 2 years, so really you're winning. Let's slide into the perfumed hallways of the medieval elite now, those magnificent maniacs who tried to outdo each other, not just with gold and titles, but with how offensively floral they could make themselves smell. You've heard of arms races, right? Welcome to the perfume wars, where lords and ladies waged scent-based psychological warfare at court, and the stakes were high. Your reputation, your nose, and, depending on what exotic oil you used, your liver. Perfume in the Middle Ages wasn't just about masking stench. It was power, prestige, a statement. If you smelled like sandalwood or musk, it meant you had the money and global trade connections to pull that off. These weren't local aromas. These were imported luxuries, extracted from plants that grew on the other side of the known world, or secreted from glands of animals you wouldn't want to meet in a dark forest. Smell like a rose garden in December? That told everyone you were rich enough to fake nature itself. And yes, perfume was political. It wasn't just worn on the body, it was worn into the room. The goal was to arrive with such a strong olfactory presence that people knew you were coming 5 seconds before you entered. If your scent lingered after you left, even better. That was social dominance. People literally measured your influence in nose mileage. But the perfume itself wasn't subtle. It was brutal. Think spiced wine, crushed flowers, honey-soaked resins, musk, civet. That's secretions from a cat's backside, by the way. And ambergris. We're back to whale vomit again, yes. Mix that all together in some animal fat or alcohol base, and you've got the medieval version of eau de status anxiety. The result? You smelled like an erotic forest fire. And they didn't dab either. There was no gentle spritz to the wrist or a tasteful touch behind the ear. No, they soaked their gloves, rubbed perfume into their hair, saturated their undergarments, even added scented wax to their moustaches. For the particularly extra, entire rooms could be perfumed. Tapestries were sprayed, floors strewn with rose petals. Servants walked through with smoking censers filled with fragrant woods before a noble entered like a nasal red carpet. Now here's the real fun. When perfumes collided, it wasn't always pleasant. At a banquet or court function, you might have 30 people all rocking different scent profiles. One guy's got strong notes of frankincense and animal musk. Another lady smells like rose water and cloves. Someone in the corner is clearly fermenting their own armpits under a layer of cinnamon. The result? A scent cloud so chaotic it could be classified as a war crime in modern olfactory terms. There are records of nobles fainting from the strength of competing odours, and honestly, that tracks. Imagine trying to deliver a diplomatic address while your nostrils are being punched repeatedly by a lavender clove urine trifecta coming off a visiting duke from Bavaria. You wouldn't make it through the opening lines without weeping. Now, perfumes weren't only used for flattery and flair. They had battlefield applications too, metaphorical battlefields, that is. At court, a clever noble might flood a rival's chamber with a scent associated with illness or impurity. Yes, perfume as passive-aggressive sabotage. There's even a recorded case where a noblewoman allegedly poisoned her enemy's perfumed gloves. Whether true or not, it was the medieval equivalent of hiding fish in the vents, just way deadlier and more stylish. Quirky fact: one particularly intense trend involved perfume-infused jewellery. Rings, lockets and brooches could be filled with scented substances. They were called vinaigrettes, and you'd sniff them in public to guard against miasmas, or more truthfully against the breath of whoever was speaking too closely to your face. It was also a way to look mysterious and dainty. Nothing says, "I'm above this peasant stench," like taking a whiff of your ruby-encrusted stink ball mid-conversation. Now, were these perfumes effective? Depends on your definition. Did they mask odours? Temporarily. Did they replace body stench with a more socially acceptable one? Yes. Did they ever make the wearer actually clean? Not even a little. People still skipped bathing, still wore the same crusty linens for weeks, still exhaled through teeth held together by prayer and sugar paste. Perfume just helped everyone pretend otherwise. There's an open debate among historians about how accessible perfumes were to the lower classes. Some suggest that herbal perfumes, like rosemary, mint, and sage, were common enough that even a modest household might have a little stash for special occasions. Others argue that any scent strong enough to compete with unwashed feet and a week of horse stables would have been priced far out of reach for common folk. The consensus: if you could afford perfume, you used it a lot. If you couldn't, you hoped the person next to you had some and would share the aroma cloud. You today are preparing to attend a royal feast. You've already coated your gloves in rose water and soaked your sleeves in a custom blend of violet and cardamom. You considered ambergris but decided against it, too marine. As you approach the great hall, you see others arriving in scent clouds of their own, like walking incense burners. The air is thick before you even step through the doors. Inside, the atmosphere is pure decadence. Roasted meats on platters, wine flowing like a small river, and the overlapping scent of 20 different nobles who all decided this was the night to wear everything in their perfumery box. It's dizzying. You find your seat, already lightheaded, and glance at your neighbour, a lady whose neckline is soaked in jasmine so strong it could cause hallucinations. She smiles. You nod politely while discreetly covering your nose with your scented sleeve. Halfway through the feast, someone spills wine. Another person lets out a silent but deadly reminder that pottage is not digestion's friend, and the court jester accidentally ignites a scented candle too close to someone's beard oil. The hall smells like singed rosemary, fermented onion, and panic. But still, this is elegance. This is refinement. The most well-dressed, well-perfumed disaster in history. Later, as you leave, your nose still twitching, you realise the perfume didn't help as much as you'd hoped. Your hair smells like roasted duck and musk, your clothes like sweat and lilies, and your dignity, mildly bruised by the realisation that even royalty can't escape the stink. But hey, you looked amazing. And in the medieval world, that's half the battle. Alright, enough tiptoeing around the edges. Let's walk straight into the heart of medieval urban horror. The open-air markets, butcher stalls, tanneries and fish vendors, also known as the death-smelling engine rooms of the medieval city. If the streets were bad and the bathhouses were questionable, the markets were their loud, wet, squelching cousins that smelled like they wanted you dead. There are stink levels, and then there's this. An aromatic symphony that could make a strong stomach tap out by sunrise. First, picture the marketplace. It's early morning, but don't imagine dewy produce carts and cheerful grandmas offering fresh basil. Instead, you've got butchers hacking through half-frozen goat carcasses with axes that double as tools for self-defense. Blood pools beneath the tables, mixing with yesterday's grease and whatever fell through the cracks last week. There's no ice, no refrigeration, no waste bins. Bones, guts and organs pile up like the world's grossest sculpture garden. Stray dogs patrol the area. So do pigs. Sometimes it's hard to tell who's doing the better job cleaning up. Fishmongers aren't helping either. Their stalls are lined with slippery silver corpses laid out on wooden boards, already warped from years of soaking in brine and decay. They gut fish right there, flinging entrails into barrels or, let's be real, onto the street. Seagulls dive bomb from above like flying pickpockets, stealing scraps and occasionally dropping unwanted bits on passers-by. You walk too close, and boom, you get splashed with fish water that smells like it's already been through someone's digestive tract. Congratulations, you're baptized in haddock juice now. But it gets even better, or worse, depending on your masochism. Let's head over to the tannery district. Now, if you've never had the pleasure, tanneries are where animal hides go to be turned into leather. This involves soaking them in a series of chemical death baths, starting with lime to strip hair, then fermented urine to soften the skin, and finally dog dung to, process the texture. And yes, that's real dog feces, collected in baskets and prized for its alleged enzymatic properties. So in short, this is a place where hides soak in filth, and people work in it. You stand near the edge of the tannery lane, and the smell hits like a physical object. Sharp, ammoniac, hot even when the air is cold. It punches your sinuses and leaves you blinking back tears. Workers slosh around in ankle-deep pits of blackish sludge, sleeves rolled up, faces blank from years of olfactory trauma. Their clothes are permanently dyed in shades of brown and grey. They probably can't smell anything anymore, and honestly, that's a gift from whatever medieval god pities leather workers. Tanners weren't just smelly, they were segregated. These businesses were usually kept far from city centres, pushed to the outskirts where the river could carry the waste downstream. Straight into someone else's drinking water. Even medieval people, who were famously tolerant of their own stink, agreed that tanneries were too much. Some cities even made laws restricting how close a tannery could operate to churches, markets, or anything involving human dignity. Quirky fact of the day: some tanners in England were paid a small bonus if they could collect and transport their own supply of dog dung. This was known as pure, hilariously, and the name stuck. So yes, workers would walk around asking neighbours for their pet's poop, then haul it in sacks to work like they were delivering fresh bread. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where nothing smells like it sounds. And now let's go back to the market, because we haven't even hit the dairy stalls yet. You think cheese smells bad now? Try it without refrigeration. Medieval cheese ranged from mildly nutty to full-blown chemical warfare. Soft cheeses were sold wrapped in cloth that could barely contain the ooze. Some vendors added herbs to mask the ripeness, which is a poetic way of saying, cover up the fact that this cheese may have become sentient. And milk? It was either fresh that morning or already sour. There was no in-between. Add to that carts full of vegetables that have seen better weeks. Wilted greens, bruised root crops, onions sprouting fuzzy growths. There's no standard for what can or can't be sold. If it isn't physically crawling away on its own, it's fair game. And behind the produce stands someone's probably boiling tripe or reheating yesterday's meat pies, emitting a greasy metallic odour that settles like fog over the entire square. But you know what? It's not all gag-worthy. These markets were the heart of community life. Amid the reek, there's laughter, gossip, deals being struck. You'd hear shouts of 2 for a penny next to someone haggling in 4 different languages. The smells were awful, yes, but they were also familiar, comforting in their own revolting way, like the olfactory version of your annoying cousin. You wouldn't choose to be near them, but they're part of your ecosystem now. There's a scholarly debate about just how much medieval people noticed these market smells. Some argue they were nose-blind, so accustomed to the aromas of life that they didn't even register them as offensive. Others point to complaints from travellers, city laws banning certain types of vendors, and medical tracts full of advice about avoiding bad air. Clearly some people cared, but most probably just shrugged and kept shopping. You, wandering through this delightful circus of bodily fluids and culinary anarchy, dodge a splash from the butcher's pail and sidestep a pig rooting through cabbage leaves. You pause to buy some dried apples from a woman whose apron could stand up on its own. Her breath smells like cider and 10 years of hard winters. She smiles, and you nod, because this is your world now, loud, messy, and unapologetically ripe. And as you chew on your leathery apple slices and try not to inhale too deeply, you realise something. For all the stench, this is where things happen. It's disgusting, yes, but it's alive. A pulsing, pungent artery of medieval life, one that you, against your better judgment, are starting to love. Okay, so let's talk beauty. Medieval beauty. And if your mind just conjured up images of flowing gowns, delicate curls, and radiant complexions straight out of a pre-Raphaelite painting, let's yank that velvet curtain down real fast. Because underneath the lace and ribbons was a harsh, powdery, lead-based reality. Welcome to the medieval makeup routine, where looking flawless meant slowly poisoning yourself, and smelling good required rubbing your face with animal fat. Glamour has never been this gruesome. You wake up in your noble chamber, sunlight filtered through dusty stained glass, your hair flattened from last night's sweat, and possibly the weight of a rat who mistook your head for a pillow. You're expected to look your best today. Maybe you're meeting someone important, or trying not to look like you've just survived a week-long dungeon stay. Either way, time to begin your routine. Step 1. Cleanse the skin. And by cleanse, we mean maybe splash a bit of rose water or vinegar on your face if you're lucky enough to have it. Soap exists, sure, but it's often too harsh for the sensitive skin of noble ladies. So you use a rag soaked in floral infusions or a paste made from ground-up almonds and honey. It's sticky, it attracts flies, but it smells better than the rest of you, so you go with it. Next, the pièce de résistance, the complexion. Pale skin was the gold standard of beauty. Why? Because it meant you didn't work in the sun like those unfortunate peasants. It meant you were delicate, refined, probably dying of some fashionable indoor illness. To get the look, women applied a face paint made from, you guessed it, lead white, a thick, chalky substance that made the face appear ghostly and smooth, while slowly destroying the skin underneath. Over time it caused sores, flaking and actual death, but that's just the price of looking ethereally tragic. For a pop of colour you'd apply rouge, usually made from red ochre, cinnabar, mercury sulfide, because why not add more poison, or crushed beetles. Lips and cheeks got the treatment, though not too much. Subtlety was key. If your skin looked too lively you risked appearing healthy, which was deeply unfashionable in high society. Hair was another battlefield. Blonde was prized, so if you weren't born with golden locks, you bleached your hair using mixtures of lye, ash and vinegar, then baked yourself in the sun until your scalp begged for mercy. Wigs existed, but they were less about glamour and more about covering up hair loss from all the bleaching and disease. Real hair was curled with hot irons, sometimes wrapped around sticks and slept on, so you'd wake up looking like a medieval poodle. Smell was a major issue here. You're wearing layers of perfume, yes, but you're also caked in animal-based creams and powders. Many cosmetics used bear fat or goose grease as a base. That means your foundation is essentially meat lotion. Add in the heat of the day, your inability to sweat properly under all those layers, and the general lack of bathing, and your face becomes a slow-cooking stew of poison, powder and poultry essence. And don't forget the eyebrows. Thin was in. You either plucked them into oblivion or shaved them off entirely, sometimes painting them back on with soot or ink. The same went for your hairline. Women actually plucked the front of their scalp to make their foreheads look higher. The ideal face was oval, elongated and hauntingly unnatural. If it made you look like a well-dressed alien from a dying star system, you nailed it. Here's your quirky fact. Some beauty recipes called for powdered pearls or crushed precious stones. Not because they had any proven effect, just because they were expensive. Imagine grinding up sapphires and patting them onto your cheeks just to show off. Medieval flexing was subtle, sparkly, and entirely impractical, like spending your rent money on a glitter bath. Now, while all of this sounds firmly rooted in the noble class, there were versions of it happening further down the social ladder. Peasant women, lacking access to exotic powders, might tint their cheeks with beet juice or rub clay on their faces for a bit of colour. They didn't have mirrors, so they went by feel and reputation. If someone told you your face looked fresh, you kept doing whatever it was, even if it involved goose dung or powdered bark. For men, the grooming rituals were more subtle but no less intense. Nobles oiled their beards, combed their moustaches, and occasionally painted their lips or darkened their lashes. Yes, eyeliner existed, and yes, some men used it, especially among certain circles that prized androgynous beauty. Looking sharp, literally sharp as in angular and pale, was the goal. Colour was for peasants and shepherds. There's a hot little scholarly debate over just how widespread cosmetic use really was. Some argue that medieval beauty practices were mostly restricted to elite court circles and weren't seen beyond the castle gates. Others suggest that beauty culture filtered down in small ways, through herbal remedies, folk tales, and local traditions of grooming that don't survive well in written records. The truth is probably a blend of both. Elite beauty trends setting the tone, with everyone else doing their best approximation with what they could forage. And now let's bring you back into this itchy, powdery world. You've just finished applying your cosmetics. Your cheeks are delicately flushed, your forehead is generously enlarged, and your face is now home to enough lid to classify you as a minor hazard zone. You sit at your dressing table, dabbing rose water on your wrists, admiring your reflection in a polished metal mirror that distorts your face just enough to make it look almost regal. You head to the hall for the evening's entertainment, gliding down the stone steps in a gown that hasn't been washed in 2 seasons. As the torchlight hits your face, it glows faintly white, the scent of your perfumed gloves clashing with the faint tang of bird fat warming on your cheeks. A nearby noble nods at you, impressed. You smile, lips stiff with cinnabar, and try not to move too much, because if you sweat, your entire face might melt off in streaks of toxic elegance. Tonight you'll flirt, feast, and fan yourself with practiced ease. Tomorrow you'll wake up with a rash, a headache, and half an eyebrow missing. But for now, you are the picture of medieval beauty. Deadly, delicate, and just a little bit fragrant. Alright, time to dive into one of the more bizarre, paranoia-drenched chapters of medieval hygiene. The widespread belief that water was not just suspicious, it was flat-out dangerous. You're living in a time where the idea of standing under falling water for 10 minutes every day would have been met with the same reaction as suggesting people lick frogs for fun. Although depending on the region, licking weird things for health was on the table, but we'll get to that another time. See, water wasn't just the stuff you drank or dumped out of chamber pots. It was a known wildcard, both a giver of life and, in the minds of many medieval folks, a potential vector of death. And that made bathing in it, especially hot water, something you did with caution, superstition, and maybe a prayer to St. Fiacre. The root of the fear lay in a mishmash of pseudoscience, tradition, and observation. The idea of the 4 humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, was the guiding light of medieval medicine. Balance was everything. Disrupt the harmony, and your body went haywire. Open your pores with hot water. Suddenly, all the bad air or miasma floating around could seep in and poison your insides. Water didn't cleanse, it exposed. Imagine being told that washing your skin too thoroughly could weaken your natural defences, that by stripping away the layer of sweat, oils, and grime, you were removing a protective film your body needed. Medieval logic. Dirt is a shield. You're basically wearing nature's hazmat suit. Removing it was like opening your front door to plague wearing nothing but a smile and optimism. And so for many, full-body baths were reserved for special occasions, before marriage, before major religious holidays, or during illness, ironically. Even then, you weren't doing it for hygiene. You were doing it as a kind of ritual. You soaked in hot water mixed with herbs and oils, sat in the tub until your skin turned prune-coloured, and hoped that the rosemary floating on top would protect you from the unseeable evils hovering just outside the room. It didn't help that public baths, those stews we mentioned earlier, got a reputation for spreading disease, especially during plague outbreaks. When people died in droves and nobody understood why, fingers pointed fast, and a hot room full of naked, sweaty strangers sharing the same tub water, that looked guilty, even if it wasn't. The bathhouse gave my cousin the plague, someone might say. Better to stay dirty and alive than clean and dead. Quirky side note. While public bathhouses were falling out of favour, sweat bathing was still going strong in some areas. Think of it like a medieval sauna. Hot rooms filled with steam, followed by a cold rinse or a dry rub with a towel. These were especially common in places like Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, where people did value heat and cleanliness in ways that seemed downright futuristic to their Western neighbours. But elsewhere, a full bath was starting to look like a last resort, or a sinful indulgence. In fact, the church occasionally took a hard line against excessive bathing. There was concern it promoted vanity, encouraged lust, wet bodies and all, and distracted from more important things, like penance, fasting, or debating whether cats were secretly in league with the devil. Monks were sometimes forbidden from bathing more than a few times a year, and even those times were supposed to be less about comfort and more about humility. Scrub your soul, not your armpits. And yet, the contradiction remained. Some medical texts of the time did recommend bathing, particularly for the sick or wounded. Doctors would prescribe warm baths infused with herbs like thyme or lavender to treat ailments ranging from stomach aches to melancholy. Of course, they also suggested bloodletting and boiled owl eggs for similar problems, so the bar for scientific rigour wasn't especially high. But the idea persisted that bathing could heal, if done right with the proper safeguards and not too often. Because again, too much water was bad. It could destabilise the body, over-relax the muscles, and let all sorts of invisible demons hitch a ride through your pores. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about just how widespread this water phobia was. Some argue that fear of bathing was mostly limited to the late medieval period and the urban elite, while others point to consistent records suggesting a much broader cultural discomfort with water. Archaeological evidence of private bathing facilities in wealthier homes seems to contradict the notion that people were universally afraid of bathing. But context matters. Having a tub didn't mean you used it regularly. It could have just been for show or for emergencies, like plague boils and marriage proposals. You, of course, are just trying to survive the week without drawing too much attention to your body odour. You haven't bathed in a month. Your shirt is absorbing the damage. You consider sneaking down to the river at night for a quick wash, but a local priest warned about the water spirits that live there. Also, last time someone tried that, they caught something that made their skin peel off like old paint. You decide against it. Instead, you heat a small pot of water over the fire and dab yourself with a rag. Face, armpits, hands. Nothing below the waist. That would be madness. You dust yourself with a mix of crushed rose petals and charcoal, then slip into your clothes before the chill can set in. You don't feel clean, but you feel ritually acceptable, which in this era is close enough. Later at a feast, you overhear someone bragging that they bathed twice this year. A collective gasp follows. One woman fans herself dramatically. Another clutches her pomander like it's a holy relic. In this climate, someone whispers, and that's the punchline of medieval hygiene. It wasn't that people didn't want to be clean, it's that being clean was seen as risky, something you did carefully, sparingly, with just enough soap to avoid divine judgment, but not enough to tempt fate. You sit back, sip your ale, and scratch your arm beneath your tunic. Maybe one day someone will invent a magical pipe that brings clean water to every house. Until then, you'll settle for warm vinegar and denial. Let's take a stroll down to your friendly neighbourhood barber. No, not the cheerful fellow with clippers and beard oil. This is the medieval barber surgeon, a man who can trim your bangs, lance a boil, and amputate your leg, all before lunch. He doesn't just handle hair, he handles everything. Teeth? Sure. Bloodletting? Absolutely. Need a hot shave with a side of leeches? He's your guy. Just don't expect it to smell like eucalyptus and neck oil in here. The scent that hits you when you step inside is a mix of burnt hair, sweat, coppery blood, and old cheese. Welcome to Hygiene, the multitask edition. The barber's shop is part salon, part operating theatre, part confessional booth. It's a narrow room, probably in a back alley or squeezed between a butcher and a tanner, because zoning laws are still just a twinkle in some bureaucrat's eye. The walls are stained, the floor is sticky, and there's always at least one mysterious stain that no one wants to identify. Tools hang from hooks, razors, scissors, pincers, hooks, and bone saws, all wiped cleanish with rags that look like they've seen several small wars. You take a seat, possibly on the same stool someone had a molar yanked out of earlier. The air's heavy with iron and something vaguely medicinal, like crushed herbs soaking in vinegar. If it's a clean shop, the barber might heat his razors in a flame before each use. Not for sterilisation, mind you, but to make sure the blade glides smoothly. Of course, if the blade is too hot, you'll leave with a matching souvenir, a half-inch wide scald on your neck. Today, you're just in for a shave and a quick bleed. Yes, bloodletting, the gold standard of medieval health practices. Feeling sluggish, too hot, headaches, melancholy, bad dreams, there's an easy fix. Drain some blood until you feel faint, then go home and eat a cold turnip. Doctors and barbers alike believed that your body's humours needed balancing, and too much blood meant chaos. So, you're cut, usually at the elbow or ankle. and the red stuff flows into a bowl while your barber hums a little tune and possibly discusses weather patterns. Sometimes they use leeches, live ones. If you're squeamish, tough luck. They attach them to your skin, let them swell with your blood, then pop them off and store them in a jar for future use. The barber claims it's therapeutic. You just try not to think about the little worm now full of your essence wriggling in a clay pot by the window. Haircuts were the easy part. Scissors snip, razors scrape, and the barber might even apply a nice thick sludge of lard and rosemary to tame the wild frizz. But even that isn't without risk. Lice and fleas are everywhere, and barbers often discover them mid-trim. The standard procedure: flick them off. Sometimes into the fire, sometimes onto the floor. Not their problem anymore. But the real horror begins when someone walks in holding their side and wincing. It's time for a minor surgery, maybe an infected abscess, or a dislocated joint, or an embedded arrowhead from a bar brawl gone spicy. The barber grabs his tools, rolls up his sleeves and gets to work. There's no anaesthesia, no antiseptic, just a good grip, a strong stomach, and someone nearby to hold the patient down and maybe offer a stick to bite on. The screaming is normal. The smell? Let's just say burning flesh and pus is not a scent you ever get used to. Quirky detail for you. The iconic red and white barber pole comes from this exact mess. The red symbolises blood, the white symbolises bandages, and the pole itself represents the staff patients gripped during bloodletting to keep from flailing. It's a literal monument to historical multitasking. Will fix your hair and your humours. And they were oddly respected, these barber surgeons. They weren't quite doctors, who were too lofty to touch actual wounds, but they had the hands-on experience to get things done. Some even served on battlefields, patching up soldiers between sword swings, or travelled with nobles as part of their household staff. Did they always know what they were doing? Debatable. But in a world where medicine involved astrology charts and prayers, the guy who could pull a tooth without dropping it in your lap was practically a wizard. There's an ongoing scholarly debate over how much medical knowledge these barbers truly had. Some argue that they were practical geniuses, the unsung heroes of pre-modern medicine, while others think they were just glorified butchers with a flair for multitasking and a steady hand. The truth? Probably somewhere in the middle. Some were competent, some were terrifying, most were both. You, brave customer, finish your bloodletting and shave with a towel pressed to your elbow, your face stinging from the razor, and your brain a little floaty from blood loss. The barber offers you a whiff of something sharp, vinegar soaked with mint probably, to keep you from passing out on the way out the door. You nod, drop a coin on the counter, and step back into the street, slightly lighter and questionably healthier. Later you admire your reflection in a puddle. The shave's clean, your head doesn't hurt anymore, though that might be the blood loss, and you can finally wear your hat without it sticking to your scalp. You've survived another visit to the medieval multi-tool with scissors. Your reward? A full-body ache, a faint buzzing in your ears, and the knowledge that your next trip might involve a tooth that's been wiggling for weeks. You make a mental note to avoid crunchy bread and think about your choices. But for now, you smell like vinegar, smoke, and hot iron. It's not pleasant, but at least it's not fish guts and foot rot. In the great medieval stink scale, you're currently breaking even. Now we descend into darkness. True, acrid, panic-soaked darkness, because nothing in medieval life rewrote the sensory landscape quite like the Black Death. One day you're worried about someone sneezing near your pottage, and the next your entire village is reduced to silence, save for the sound of distant church bells tolling. For people you haven't even realised are dead yet, but forget the bodies for a second. Forget the death counts and the cryptic flagellants and the questionable plague doctors in leather beaks. Let's talk about what the Black Death smelled like, because it wasn't just terrifying, it was putrid. You walk into a plague-struck town and it's as if the earth itself is rotting. The air is thick, humid, even if it's winter. You can't tell where the smell begins or ends because it seems to cling to your skin, crawl into your hair, settle under your fingernails. A blend of sweat, decay, mildew, blood, vomit, and something you can't quite place. Something sour and metallic and ancient. That's the scent of a civilization cracking. The plague didn't just kill bodies. It overwhelmed every system meant to handle them. Cemeteries filled up, fast. Gravediggers either died or ran. Whole families were wiped out in days, and their homes were simply boarded up left to fester. Inside, the air turned toxic. Sometimes you'd smell a plague house before you even saw it. just a slow, sweet stench leaking through the wood like fog. And then there were the mass graves, pit after pit dug on the edge of town, filled with bodies heaped like logs, covered in lime, then dirt, then more bodies. The scent of death was so strong it overpowered even the spices and vinegar-soaked cloths people stuffed into their noses. Some tried to light fires or carry sweet-smelling herbs in their hands. Others held oranges pierced with cloves up to their faces, but nothing could block it. The stench of decay was an equal opportunity invader. It didn't care if you were noble or beggar. It found your nose and nested there. Of course, the smell of the disease itself was no better. The infected reeked. Buboes, those painful, swollen lumps under the arms and around the groin, would burst, leaking pus and blood. The breath of plague victims carried a sickly sweet odour that one chronicler compared to rotting apples mixed with something boiled in bile. Skin blackened, gangrene set in, fevers caused hallucinations, and patients would sweat through sheets in hours. Every fluid the human body could produce came out, and all of it reeked like the end of the world. People believed that this bad air or miasma was the cause of the disease, and honestly, with no knowledge of bacteria or fleas, you can't blame them. They saw a pattern. Foul air equals death. So they lit incense, hung herbs in windows, slaughtered animals whose breath was considered unlucky, and burned barrels of pitch in the streets to purify the atmosphere. Did any of it help? Not with the plague. But the attempts at controlling the smell were relentless. A quirky fact from the depths of plague panic: some doctors recommended bathing in your own urine to prevent infection. Others suggested inhaling the flatulence of healthy people. One text even recommended keeping a goat in your home because the smell of its dung might draw out the corrupted vapours. That's right. Fighting smell with worse smell was a legitimate medical strategy. Medieval problems called for medieval solutions. And of course, the infamous plague doctors. Their long dark robes, wide-brimmed hats, and terrifying beaked masks weren't just for show. Those beaks were stuffed with herbs, dried flowers, vinegar-soaked sponges, anything to filter the miasma. To modern eyes, they look like death itself walking. But in their time, they were walking air purifiers. They believed that if they couldn't smell the disease, they might not catch it. Spoiler, that logic failed miserably, but points for creativity. There's a hot debate among scholars about how the smell of plague influenced medieval responses. Some argue that the overwhelming sensory trauma of the Black Death reshaped public health forever, leading to early quarantine laws, cleaner city planning, and even the concept of air purification. Others believe the emphasis on smell and air was a distraction, pulling attention away from more effective practices, like isolating the sick and, say, killing rats. Either way, the obsession with stench is undeniable. Now picture yourself walking through one of these towns. You have a bundle of dried herbs pressed to your face. Lavender, maybe. Or thyme. Your eyes water from the smoke of a nearby pyre, where clothes and bedding of the dead are being burned. You step around something in the street. You hope it's just garbage. A man stumbles past you, muttering, with dried blood at the corners of his mouth. He smells like warm milk gone rancid. You try not to breathe in. It doesn't work. You reach the edge of town where the fields used to smell of wet hay and morning dew. Now they're full of temporary graves. The earth has been turned so often that it no longer holds the scent of soil. It just reeks of rot. You pause, overwhelmed. Your stomach rolls. You're not sick, not yet, but you feel something inside you shift. A realization, this is what death smells like. Not dramatic, not poetic, just sticky, putrid, and all-consuming. At night, the scent still clings to you. Your clothes carry it, your hands carry it. You lie awake, staring at the ceiling of your cottage, wondering if the itch in your throat is the beginning of the end. Somewhere in the village, a bell tolls again. Another neighbour, gone. You press your herb bundle to your face and try to sleep. And in the morning, it will all still be there. The disease, the fear, the smell, especially the smell. Let's head inside a medieval castle now. You know the type. Turrets scraping the sky, thick stone walls, banners flapping in the breeze, and a great hall filled with feasting nobles and brooding portraits. Very majestic, very epic. But the truth? Living in a castle in the Middle Ages came with its own kind of horror, particularly if you had the misfortune of being born with a functioning nose. Because if the peasantry had mud and manure, castles had their own unique brand of aristocratic funk centred around one delightful architectural innovation: the garderobe. A garderobe sounds fancy, right? Like a wardrobe. A place where fine silks are stored, maybe next to some crushed rose petals and a polished mirror. Except no. A garderobe is the castle's toilet. Or more accurately, a glorified hole in the wall, sometimes enclosed, sometimes not, that emptied straight into the moat below. It was a seat perched over a shaft, usually with a wooden bench, sometimes lined with stone, often positioned right off a hallway or tucked inside a small side chamber, with a window for airflow. There was no privacy, no plumbing, no dignity. And the smell? Imagine a latrine that hasn't been cleaned in ever. Add the warm waft of composting excrement swirling gently on the wind, stirred up by passing servants and bouncing off the stone walls like a pinball of regret. That's your castle bathroom experience. Some castles had multiple garderobes, built vertically so waste from each level dropped into a single chute or pit. This created what you might call the medieval equivalent of a sewer system, except there were no pipes, no flushing, and no end in sight. Sometimes the pit was just an open trench. Sometimes it emptied directly into the moat. Yes, the very same moat that was supposed to deter enemies, and which often doubled as a lovely open-air cesspool, complete with floating refuse and the occasional bloated fish who probably wished it had lived in a better century. Now here's a truly special detail. People sometimes used moats for fishing, and even drew water from them in a pinch. That's right. Need to wash your hands? Better hope you're upstream from Sir Edgar's morning constitutional. Of course, nobles weren't crawling down garderobe shafts to clean them. That job fell to the night soil men, servants tasked with removing accumulated waste or occasionally stirring the pit to make room. These workers were either deeply underpaid or possibly paid in blessings and trauma. Some castle records show special trench digging events, where the castle's waste pits were fully emptied into nearby woods or rivers, usually once the smell became unbearable, which was apparently a subjective line that took a terrifyingly long time to cross. And even if you avoided the garderobe altogether, you weren't safe. Castles were huge, drafty, and packed with people. Cooks, guards, musicians, nobles, visiting dignitaries, jesters, assorted hangers-on, all of whom were eating, sweating, sleeping, and doing very human things in close quarters. The great halls may have looked grand, with their roaring fires and massive tapestries, but you were still sitting in a room where the stone walls trapped heat, smoke, and body odour like a Dutch oven of nobility. Feasts added their own special layer. Picture it. Roasting meat, spilled wine, unwashed hands grabbing at greasy platters, bones tossed on the floor, dogs circling underfoot, licking up drips of stew. No forks. Those hadn't quite caught on yet, so everything is eaten with fingers or knives, and then those fingers wipe off on the nearest fabric. Sometimes the fabric is clothing, sometimes it's someone else's sleeve, and those sleeves? Rarely washed. Now back to the garderobe for a moment, because it gets weirder. Some nobles stored their clothes in or near the garderobe. Why? Because the smell of ammonia from the urine helped keep the moths away. That's right. The very room that made you gag also doubled as moth prevention. You're trying to picture a lady's velvet gown hanging beside an open hole to a pit of collective digestion, and your brain is screaming. But this was real, and in its way, practical. Quirky fact. One king, Edward I of England, was said to have commissioned a luxury garderobe with a padded seat and a small window overlooking the garden. So yes, you could admire the tulips while emptying your bowels directly onto the unsuspecting earth below. A throne for a king, quite literally. There's some scholarly discussion about just how common garderobes were versus more rustic solutions like chamber pots or simple outhouses. Some historians argue that the majestic castle garderobe has been romanticised or overly vilified by later writers. Others maintain that these systems were real, widely used, and as horrifyingly smelly as the records suggest. The truth probably depends on the size of the castle, the wealth of the owner, and how many guests they were trying to impress before their nostrils turned inside out. You, noble resident of this stone-scented kingdom, make your way to the garderobe after dinner. It's a cold, echoey room with a small hole over the pit, a pile of straw or moss to wipe with, and a rope to hold onto if you want to avoid falling in. Because yes, that happened. Falling into the waste pit wasn't just a nightmare, it was a real occupational hazard. Some unlucky servants and drunk guests met their end this way, remembered not for their valour, but for their tragic and aromatic exits. You try not to breathe through your nose, do what you came to do, and leave quickly, boots squelching on the slightly damp flagstones. Later, as you climb into your bedchamber, only mildly smoky, slightly musty, and mercifully upwind of the garderobe, you wrap yourself in moth-bitten furs and try not to think about the river of waste flowing somewhere beneath your floorboards. In the morning, you'll splash a bit of scented vinegar on your neck and face, maybe dab at your clothes with a perfumed cloth, and pretend that you're not living inside a glorified outhouse with flags, because that's what castle life is. All the majesty of feudal Europe, and all the smells of a particularly unlucky stable. Let's pause a moment and take a deep imaginary breath. Not a real one, unless you've got a lavender sachet strapped to your face, because by now your senses have been through the ringer. You've braved chamber pots, open sewers, rotting meat markets, and the uniquely offensive scent of plague pits. But here's the truly terrifying part. Medieval people didn't seem to mind. Or at least they didn't act like it. That nose-wrinkling, eye-watering stew of bodily fluids and animal entrails we've been swimming through, they were largely noseblind to it. Welcome to the great medieval olfactory desensitization. Now don't misunderstand, they could smell. They weren't physiologically different from us. They had the same olfactory receptors, the same neurological wiring. But they were raised in an environment that trained their senses to adapt, or shut down entirely. It's not so much that they liked the smells, it's that they didn't register them as extraordinary. They lived nose first in an atmosphere we would describe as biohazardous, and they just called it Tuesday. Picture a child born into a small medieval town. From the moment they emerge, likely in a room with poor ventilation, sweating midwives and a lot of hay, they're absorbing the ambient aroma of a world with no plumbing, no refrigeration, and a very relaxed attitude about meat storage. That's their baseline, their normal, their home. By the time they're 6, they've watched animals defecate in the street, helped scrub blood off their family's butcher stall, and stepped over more than one decomposing rat without a second thought. By 16, they probably carry their own unique odour portfolio: sweat, smoke, sheep, and last Tuesday's stew. Your nose, freshly transported from the modern era, would mutiny in moments, but their noses, they adapted. Gradually smell became a background noise, something acknowledged only when it became truly offensive, like say a festering wound or a 5-day-old corpse wedged behind a woodpile. It took a lot to rise above the olfactory threshold in medieval life. But this desensitization had consequences. People didn't notice when things started to rot until it was dangerously late. Bad meat? Just cut around the green bits. Foul water? Add some vinegar and hope. Wound smelling off? Probably just humours acting up. And when disease did start spreading, it was harder to identify the warning signs because the baseline already smelled like a mild apocalypse. That said, people still associated scent with morality and health. Even if they didn't react to everyday filth, they were quick to assign meaning to unfamiliar or extreme odours. A strange new smell might mean spiritual corruption, sin, or, if it was really unpleasant, witchcraft. Yes, some people genuinely believed that bad smells could indicate demonic influence. The devil, in popular belief, stank like sulphur and rot. If your neighbour's house began to smell worse than usual, suspicions rose. And on the flip side, sweet-smelling people were often assumed to be virtuous, or even holy. There are saints said to have emitted pleasant fragrances even after death. These odours of sanctity were taken as signs that the body was blessed, not decomposing. In some cases, fragrant corpses were paraded through towns as proof of divine favour. Imagine being so nose-blind that you think a floral-scented cadaver is something to celebrate. Here's a quirky detail. Some medieval homes were constructed with special chimney flues and airflow designs intended to carry smells away from living spaces. They didn't always work, but the effort was there. In cities, wealthier neighbourhoods were built upwind of tanneries and marketplaces whenever possible. The idea was to strategically avoid smell, not eliminate it. Even city planners, such as they were, understood that stench had direction. Of course, this olfactory apathy wasn't universal. Travellers, especially those from other regions, noticed and commented on the smell of towns they visited. Merchants arriving from cleaner ports described inland cities as choking with the smell of filth and fish. Religious pilgrims noted the pungent incense of sin and livestock. It's possible that moving between areas with different stench profiles was what finally woke up people's noses. And let's not forget the role of seasons. In winter, the cold masked some of the worst smells, freezing over waste pits and muting decay. But come spring and summer, everything thawed, everything steamed. The sun baked the streets until the effluvia of the last 6 months emerged like some vengeful ghost. It was so bad in some places that chroniclers referred to summer as the reeking time. Fun fact, that's the title of a poem no one ever wrote, for obvious reasons. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how conscious people were of the smellscape around them. Some argue that the medieval world had a different relationship with scent altogether, that it was more symbolic than sensory. Smell was about meaning, not pleasure or discomfort. Others insist that people did notice the stench. They just lacked the tools and infrastructure to do anything about it. Think of it like being stuck on a long-haul flight next to someone eating tuna. You're not okay with it, you're just helpless. You, of course, are the 14th century version of a hypersensitive outsider. Your nose still flinches when you enter a crowded room. Your eyes water every time you pass a stable, and your dreams are haunted by the smell of wet wool left to dry on a smoking hearth. Everyone else, they don't even blink. The town priest greets you with a breath that could knock out a goat. The tavern maid serves you a bowl of pottage with a wink, and a hand that still smells faintly of pickled eel. The local blacksmith hasn't changed his tunic since Easter, and sweats like a horse in a forge, and yet no one says a thing. At first you gag silently, then you hold your breath, then gradually you stop noticing. It doesn't smell good, of course, but it becomes normal. A kind of nose equilibrium sets in. You learn to ignore it, or at least brace for it. Your gag reflex relaxes, your brain waves a white flag and adjusts the dial down to tolerate. And that, my poor friend, is how the medieval world wins. Not through sanitation or air fresheners, but through pure, unrelenting exposure. Over time, your nose gives up. You no longer react to the stink of humanity pressed too closely together. You've been nose-blind initiated, you've adapted. And honestly, that might be the most terrifying part of all. As night falls over your bustling little medieval village, it's finally time to go home, kick off your shoes, or more accurately, your thick leather things crusted with weeks of mystery muck, and crawl into bed. You think, peace at last. But not so fast, because bedtime in the Middle Ages wasn't about drifting off in lavender-scented sheets after a hot shower. It was about accepting that your mattress might actually be alive. Not metaphorically, literally, with bugs. Your bed, if you're lucky, is a wooden frame with a rope lattice and a sack stuffed with straw, feathers, or maybe dried moss. If you're really lucky, someone replaced the straw in the last few months. But usually, it's been there for ages, compressing into a grimy, lumpy mat that smells like sweat, animal dander, and the long, slow death of fabric. The bedding is shared, sometimes with your spouse, sometimes with siblings, sometimes with everyone in your family depending on how small your house is. Privacy is a modern invention, so is personal space. And then there are your nighttime companions, lice, fleas, and bedbugs. These weren't pests in the medieval sense, they were just part of the bedding ecosystem. Lice crawled through your hair and into your seams. Fleas leapt between bodies like tiny circus performers, and bedbugs nestled deep in the creases of your mattress, waiting for you to exhale so they could make their move. You didn't fight these creatures, you tolerated them, you scratched, you occasionally changed your undershirt. If you were really determined, you might hang your mattress outside in the sun and hope the heat baked a few of them into oblivion. But they always came back. People didn't even have words for infestation the way we do now. Instead, they had polite terms like companions or hitchers. It was just understood that if your bed didn't have something crawling in it, you probably had the plague or were already dead. Even nobles weren't immune. Royal bedding might be embroidered and scented with herbs, but the moment it was laid out on a warm body for more than an hour, it was fair game for tiny squatters. Monarchs scratched like the rest of us. The smells of medieval beds were something else entirely. Bedding absorbed everything: sweat, spilled food, ale, fire smoke, the occasional bodily function. And because laundering full bedding was nearly impossible without destroying it, people did what they could. They aired it out, they added herbs to it, or they just accepted that it now smelled like a cross between damp wool and foot soup. Some families scattered dried lavender or wormwood in their bedding to try and ward off fleas. Others relied on smoke, literally holding sheets over a smoky fire to cleanse them. The result? A charming blend of mothball meets campfire meets armpit. Now, as for pyjamas, those didn't exist. You either slept in the same clothes you wore during the day, or stripped down to your undergarments. If you were particularly fancy, you might own a nightshirt. But more often than not, people bundled up in whatever kept them warm. Multiple layers of linen, wool, sometimes even a hooded cloak, all piled under a rough blanket or a tattered fur. You didn't care how it looked. You cared if it kept your toes from turning blue. Quirky detail of the night. Some people slept with hot stones tucked into a cloth and placed at the foot of the bed to keep their legs warm. Others, especially in country homes, slept next to small animals, not because they were lonely, but because goats and dogs produced body heat. If you've ever cuddled with a farm animal under a single ratty blanket in a cold room full of fleas, then congratulations, you've nailed medieval comfort. Now let's talk about the bedroom air. The medieval home wasn't insulated. There were gaps in the walls, no real windows, just shutters, and at night, fires went out, especially if fuel was scarce. So the room was cold and damp and smelled like stale air, smoke, and the contents of the chamber pot tucked under your bed. Remember that? Yep, still there. And unless you empty it every morning, it'll start greeting you with its own brand of nasal aggression by night too. And oh yes, the chamber pot. Positioned close for nighttime use because who wants to stumble through a freezing yard in bare feet to a latrine? If you're discreet, you use it quickly and slide it back under the bed. If not, you might knock it over. And then your mattress isn't just uncomfortable, it's haunted, with the smell of ammonia and shame. There's actually a scholarly discussion about how people perceived sleep quality back then. It wasn't like today, where 8 uninterrupted hours is the dream. People slept in segments. You'd doze off for a few hours, wake in the middle of the night to tend the fire, maybe say a prayer or stir the soup, then go back to sleep until dawn. Some even used this first sleep and second sleep pattern to meditate or sneak out to commit light mischief. But whether you were asleep or not, you were definitely sharing your bed with more than just your thoughts. You tonight are trying to sleep. You've just scratched at your scalp for the 5th time. Something rustled in the straw beneath your mattress. Probably just a mouse. Possibly a rat. You're wrapped in 2 threadbare wool blankets that smell like they were washed last during a full moon you don't even remember. The fire has died. Your toes are cold. Your face is warm from your own breath trapped under the blanket. You roll over and nudge your sibling who mumbles in protest but doesn't wake. A flea bites your ankle. You sigh. Outside it's quiet. The village dogs bark once, then settle. You hear the wind rattle the shutters. Inside your nose begins to forget the smells. The stale air, the old sweat, the faint barnyard aroma of your bedding. They blur together. You breathe shallowly, your eyes close, and in that strange flea-bitten limbo between waking and sleep you realise this is normal. This is what bedtime smells like. Not comfort, just existence. Now let's creep into the candlelit corners of medieval life where things got truly visceral. Childbirth. Forget modern hospitals, prenatal vitamins and peppermint-scented essential oils. In the Middle Ages, bringing a baby into the world was a gamble wrapped in blood, sweat and screaming, and it stank. Not in the figurative, ugh, this sucks way, but in the literal, punch you in the face with your eyelids kind of way. Because childbirth wasn't just dangerous, it was also profoundly unsanitary. Let's set the scene. A dimly lit room in a drafty cottage or upper floor chamber. No running water, no sterile tools, just wooden walls soaked with years of smoke and moisture. The windows are shut tight, not for privacy, but to keep out the bad air. Remember miasma? They thought fresh air could invite in evil spirits or plague-bearing breezes. So they sealed the room and let the sweat, blood, and fear stew in their own juices. The smell hits before the first scream, hot, sour, earthy, like old meat and panic. The birthing bed is usually just a straw mattress laid flat or slightly inclined, covered in coarse linen. It's been reused many times, by sisters, cousins, mothers, possibly livestock. Sheets are boiled, if you're lucky, but most of the time they're simply beaten clean and laid out again. Around the bed gather a midwife, a few female relatives or neighbours, and maybe an unlucky husband who's either too worried to leave or too shocked to move. There are no gloves, no antiseptic, just hands, cloths, hot water, and a whole lot of shouting. As the labour drags on, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, the room begins to transform. Bodies sweat. The birthing woman often vomits from pain or panic. Urine and faeces mix with the fluids of childbirth. Midwives encourage the mother to drink wine or ale for strength, which doesn't help with the mess when she throws it all back up onto the rushes covering the floor. Someone might burn herbs like sage or juniper, not because they think it smells nice, but because they believe the smoke keeps demons away. It doesn't. But it does add another layer to the stifling, choking scent of the room. And when the baby finally comes, if it comes, the event is equal parts triumph and trauma. There's blood, and a lot of it. There are tears, screams, sometimes silence. The baby is swaddled immediately, but not washed, just wiped down with whatever cloth is closest. Bathing a newborn was risky, they believed. The baby's skin was sacred, soft, and not to be touched by cold water too soon, lest illness strike. Meanwhile, the placenta is expelled and dealt with, however the local tradition dictates. Some bury it under the hearth, others burn it, and in a few darker corners of folk medicine, parts of it are used in potions. Yes, really, nothing went to waste, not even the afterbirth. After delivery, the real test begins, the purifying period. A woman who had just given birth was considered spiritually and physically unclean. For 40 days she stayed indoors, often in the same room, recovering in isolation with the baby. This was both a spiritual tradition and, unintentionally, one of the smartest postnatal infection control practices they ever had. Though it wasn't framed that way. It was called churching, and at the end of the 40 days the mother would be ritually welcomed back into church, cleansed, and readmitted to society. Until then, she was stuck in that same dark room with soiled linens, leaking wounds, a crying newborn, and all the delightful fragrances that came with them. And oh, the baby wasn't the only one soiling things. Postpartum bleeding lasted for weeks. There were no pads, just wadded linen, moss, or sheep's wool stuffed between the legs and changed. Again, if someone thought to boil water and had time between fetching firewood and trying not to die of infection. Midwives sometimes used wine or vinegar to clean the mother. Imagine the burn. Now imagine that on torn flesh. Quirky, read alarming fact. Some traditions believed that evil spirits or the devil himself could sneak in during childbirth and swap a healthy baby with a changeling. To ward off these swaps, families might hang iron shears above the bed, keep a candle burning all night, or sprinkle blessed salt around the infant. So not only did you have to survive childbirth, you had to supervise it for demonic activity. No pressure. There's scholarly debate about the mortality rates for childbirth in the Middle Ages. Some believe it was astronomically high, while others argue that most healthy women survived if the birth was uncomplicated and attended by an experienced midwife. But everyone agrees on this. It was dangerous, exhausting, and profoundly unsanitized. For every safe delivery, there was another plagued by infection, hemorrhaging, or a breech birth that no amount of praying or poultices could fix. You, for tonight, are the midwife. You've been summoned by a neighbour banging on your door before dawn. The mother is already moaning, sweat pouring from her face. You step into the birthing room and the heat hits like a wave. It smells of copper, sour ale, smoke and desperation. You kneel beside the bed, murmuring calming words, and get to work. Your hands are stained, your knees ache, and your eyes sting from the smoke. Time passes in a haze of effort and noise. When the baby finally arrives, purple and screaming, you cut the cord with a dull knife and wrap it quickly, then turn your attention to the mother. She's exhausted, shaking. You wipe her forehead, pack moss between her thighs, and pray her bleeding slows. The room is heavy with breath and fluids and exhaustion. You crack a window. Just a bit. Enough to let in some air and maybe release the ghosts. Later, when you walk home at sunrise, your hands still reek. You'll wash them with cold water and ash, but the smell lingers under your nails. You lie down, but sleep won't come. Not yet, because you've seen what survival looks like, and what it smells like, and you'll be back again soon. There's always another birth, another scream, another room full of blood and incense and unrelenting stink. Let's take a moment to turn our noses towards something less bloody, but just as aromatic in its own special way. Medieval food preparation. Now, you might be thinking, Oh, at least this part smells better. It's food. And sure, on a good day, when the kitchen's humming and the roast pig hasn't fallen into the fire pit, the aromas could be downright mouth-watering. Spice stews, sizzling fat, fresh-baked bread. That is, until you realise none of it's been refrigerated. The meat was probably green this morning, and the cooking area doubles as a petting zoo with ambition. First we enter the kitchen, not a tidy galley with white tile and polished copper pans, but a large soot-blackened room tucked somewhere near the edge of the manor or castle. Why? Because kitchens burn down all the time. You don't put open flames next to your feasting hall unless you're planning on hosting a surprise funeral. Inside, the heat is stifling, especially in summer. There's no chimney, just a hole in the ceiling if you're lucky. The air is thick with smoke, grease, and the distant lingering note of boiled cabbage. Something's always simmering, roasting, smoking, or burning, usually all at once. The floor is slick with old drippings, flour, fish scales, and whatever the dog brought in. Speaking of dogs, there's always at least two in the kitchen, licking up scraps, barking at the cook, or dragging a stolen ham across the flagstones. Chickens cluck underfoot, and a pig may be tied in the corner, oinking resentfully as it contemplates both its fate and the stench of its surroundings. Now let's talk about ingredients. Meat, if you've got it, is often past its prime. Preservation methods are basic: salt, smoke, drying, but only work if done correctly. And even then, a salted joint of beef left too long can develop a crust that's more mystery than muscle. Smells? Sharp, tangy, sometimes sweet in the wrong way. Meat that's just about to turn, or already has, is often served anyway. The trick? Heavily spiced sauces. If you can't stop the meat from rotting, drown it in cinnamon, cloves, garlic or vinegar until your guests stop asking questions and start drinking more ale. And let's not forget fish. Inland villages receive their supply days after the catch, carted in barrels, packed in salt, or just damp. Eels, carp and herring were staples, especially during fasting seasons. But the smell? Oh, the smell. Imagine a fish market that's also a compost heap and has been left in the sun for a weekend. Now imagine that scent wafting through your kitchen as the fish are cleaned with knives that haven't seen hot water in months. Lovely. Even the safe foods had their issues. Dairy, for example. Milk turned fast, and sour milk, called clabber, was often consumed because tossing it out was unthinkable. Cheese was hard and salty. Butter was homemade, and it reeked of the cow, the churn, and the hands that made it. The more rural the household, the more flavourful the butter became. Sometimes people added herbs to mask that flavour. Sometimes they just powered through it. And vegetables? Well, root crops kept best. Onions, leeks, garlic, turnips, and all of them were known for a certain aroma, combined with cabbage, which was everywhere, and you had a gas-filled, sulphurous delight stewing in pots so old the iron flaked into your soup like pepper. Spices helped, if you could afford them. Poor folk made do with wild herbs, while the rich imported saffron and nutmeg, which they used in absurd quantities to prove they could. One of the strangest aromas came from medieval baking. Fresh bread smelled good, yes, but baking happened once a week, and the bread had to last. So by day 5, your loaf was hard, slightly mouldy, and may have been gnawed on by rats during the night. When you toasted it over the fire to revive it, the mould burned off and created a sour, dusty smell that clung to your clothes. Bon appetit, quirky fact time. Medieval cooks sometimes used fake ingredients. There's a whole genre of dishes where food was disguised to look like something else. Think meatballs painted with saffron to resemble golden fruit, or pies filled with live birds. Yes, that nursery rhyme had historical truth. Why? Partly for entertainment, partly because you weren't always sure what you were being served. If it looked good and smelled spicy, you probably just kept eating and hoped your intestines could handle it. There's a scholarly debate about how safe medieval food really was. Some argue that people developed stronger digestive systems due to regular exposure to microbes, while others suggest food poisoning was a constant, unspoken companion. Chronic stomach complaints were widespread, but few made the connection between bad meat and bad health. Instead, the blame went to wet humours, hot livers, or, our favourite scapegoat, miasma. You today are on kitchen duty. You're turning a spit over the fire, roasting a leg of something that may have been a deer, or may have been caught stealing turnips from the manor garden. Either way, the smell is intense. Grease hitting fire, meat sizzling, and that faint edge of spoilage masked by garlic and wild rosemary. The cook yells at you to stir the cabbage pot. You do, reluctantly, and gag slightly at the bubbling mass of green and grey leaves that's more texture than vegetable. Dinner is served on coarse wooden trenchers, shared among 4 people. You dig in with your fingers, tearing off meat and dipping bread in a sauce so vinegary it makes your eyes water. Someone burps loudly. No one flinches. It's just part of the ambience. You glance down at your portion and realise it's still steaming, but not from heat, from activity. You pick around the edge and try not to inhale too deeply. Later you help scrub pots using sand and cold water. The grease clings stubbornly. You try not to touch the congealed glob stuck in the corner of the cauldron. You don't know what it is. No one does. The scullion shrugs and throws some more ash on it. The pot looks clean enough, and when you finally walk out into the cold night, the smoke clinging to your hair, your tunic reeking of onions and goat fat, your hands stained with something yellowish, you take a deep breath of the outside air. It smells like manure and burning wood, and somehow it's refreshing, because inside, dinner just happened. And no matter what they tell you about medieval cuisine being flavourful and rustic and quaint, it was also a fire hazard, a digestive gamble, and 9 times out of 10, just plain rank. Let's wander outside again, this time into the realm of public festivals and celebrations, where the whole town gathers to dance, drink, feast and forget their problems for a while. Music fills the air, coloured banners flap overhead, pigs roast on spits, and people are drunk by noon. Sounds delightful, right? A little chaotic, maybe, but cheerful. Well, until you start breathing through your nose. Because as it turns out, nothing concentrates the raw essence of medieval humanity quite like a party. 1,000 people packed into a muddy square, wearing their week-old tunics, guzzling ale, and relieving themselves wherever they please. Ah yes, the sweet scent of merriment and microbial mayhem. You arrive at the May Day festival. There's music. Hurdy-gurdies, flutes, bagpipes, and people clapping and spinning around the maypole, garlands of crushed flowers in their hair, bees occasionally circling a little too close to the fun. Someone hands you a cup of ale that tastes vaguely like vinegar and old socks. It's warm, naturally. You nod politely and sip it anyway, because that's what everyone's doing. The scent of roasted meat wafts through the square. That's the good part. Lamb turning over a fire, dripping fat onto the coals, sending up puffs of mouth-watering smoke. But layered under that are the smells that don't come from food. The packed crowd radiating body heat and week-old sweat, the wet dog odour of sheepskin cloaks, the scent of damp wool slowly steaming in the sun. Someone steps beside you and raises their arms to cheer. Your face is now squarely in their armpit zone. You try not to flinch. They smell like hard labour and dried fish. You pretend to sneeze and pivot away. The streets are lined with vendors shouting about pies, sweetmeats, honeyed almonds and fried dough. The food smells delicious, until you realise it's been sitting out for hours and the flies are doing their best to own a share of it. One pastry looks like it's growing a light fuzz. You politely pass. Then there's the beer tent. Really more of a beer area, filled with barrels, swaying townsfolk, and the distinct smell of spilled alcohol baking in the sun. This is also where you'll find a mix of other uninvited aromas: vomit, stale bread, and that ever-present tang of urine. Because where are the toilets? Oh, there aren't any. If you need to go, you do what everyone else does. You find a wall, a bush, or a ditch. And sometimes, when the lines get too long or the ale hits too hard, people don't make it that far. The result is a kind of ambient human funk that makes you wish your nose had a dial you could turn down to mild horror. Now, for those who've really committed to the festival spirit, things get looser. Children run barefoot through puddles of things that definitely aren't rainwater. Animals are everywhere. Goats tethered to carts, dogs fighting over bones, a chicken that may or may not be involved in a betting game, and horses, lots of horses, all of whom are, of course, pooping freely. There's a boy with a shovel trying to clear the worst of it, but he's mostly just smearing it around with the flair of an abstract artist. And yet the people are smiling, laughing, shouting. They barely seem to notice the stench. They've dressed in their best, which to be fair means a tunic that's only stained on one side, and hose that mostly match. Many have tried to freshen up. Women wear garlands of rosemary or rose petals around their necks. Men dab themselves with scented oils or rub their hands with herbs. Someone even walks by with a little bag of crushed cloves hanging from their belt like an ancient air freshener. It helps, slightly. Quirky detail. Some festivals had contests for best scent. People made pomanders, little balls of wax, herbs and resins, and wore them on chains around their necks or belts. Judges would sniff each entrant like they were choosing a prize truffle, a pomander that could mask the surrounding filth for more than a few minutes, worth its weight in gold. Now come evening, things take a turn. The sun goes down, the ale goes up, and inhibitions fall like rotten apples. Drunken singing fills the square, often off-key and always enthusiastic. People dance barefoot. Some pass out near the fire. A few couples stumble off behind carts, into shadowy corners, or just don't bother hiding. Modesty is a luxury when the town's swimming in mead, and the street's already so filthy it can't get worse. Fires are lit. The air grows thick with smoke and roasted meat and sweat. People fan themselves with dirty hats. The scent of rosemary wilts, overtaken by the sour heat of 1,000 unwashed bodies pressed together. Somewhere, someone throws up in a barrel. No one moves the barrel. There's some academic back and forth about how much medieval people really enjoyed these festivals versus endured them out of tradition and obligation. Some historians see them as a release valve for society, a way to blow off steam in a world that otherwise offered very little joy. Others argue that many townspeople dreaded the chaos, the smell, the danger of overcrowding and drunken brawls. Either way, they happened, and everyone showed up. Stinking, sweating, snacking, singing. Because what else were you going to do? Sit home and listen to the lice scratch? As the night winds down, you find yourself perched on a barrel, not that barrel, watching the last dancers spin in the firelight. Your clothes reek of smoke and sweat and mystery grease from a meat pie that exploded in your hand. Your shoes are muddy, your nose is tired, you smell like the village. You are the village. And the village, in this moment, smells like life. Overwhelming, absurd, and slightly fermented. You walk home under a moonlit sky, passing other festival goers slumped against trees snoring softly. The air is finally cool. The worst of the smells settle behind you, but they linger, still clinging to your tunic, your hair, your skin, a souvenir of celebration. And when you crawl into your bug-riddled bed, you close your eyes and realise you didn't even notice the fleas tonight. Because for all its stink, the festival did what it was meant to do, distract you from everything else. And now, let's dive into the most elite, perfumed, pampered, and theoretically spotless segment of medieval society, the clergy. You'd think that monks, nuns, and priests, devoted as they were to God, prayer and ritual cleanliness, might have smelled slightly better than the average muck-covered peasant. After all, they spent their days reading Latin, not shoveling manure. But alas, a life of holy devotion didn't necessarily mean a life of sweet-smelling sanctity. In fact, religious spaces carried their own particular bouquet. 1 part incense, 1 part candle wax, and 10 parts very old, very sweaty humanity, living in close quarters under vows of poverty and, crucially, limited bathing. We begin at the monastery, where the stone halls echo with quiet chants and the distant creak of wooden sandals. Monks live communally, sleep in dormitories, eat in silence, and wake before dawn. Their daily lives are deeply structured: prayers, meals, study, work. But physical hygiene isn't always top of the list. Bathing, depending on the order, is either discouraged or scheduled so infrequently it's basically a holiday. Some monastic rules permitted bathing only a few times a year, Easter being a popular option. The rest of the time, monks focused on the purification of the soul, not the body. And their bodies, they showed it. The typical monk's wardrobe was a wool habit, worn every day, rain or shine, with linen underclothes if resources allowed. These robes were rarely washed, partly out of practicality, and partly out of ascetic belief that enduring discomfort brought one closer to God. So the smell? Pungent, damp, like a burlap sack left in a barn for a few seasons and then wrapped around someone fasting on cabbage and beans. Living in a community of men who don't bathe, don't change clothes often, and live off a diet of legumes and boiled grains, you start to see where this is going. The dormitory, long cold and lined with straw mattresses, becomes an olfactory war zone by midnight. The air is thick with the scent of unwashed feet, breath laced with sour ale and silence, and the unmistakable aroma of fermented prayer. You might be thinking, but surely churches smelled better. Well, sort of. Incense was a major part of the religious experience, especially in Catholic services. Frankincense, myrrh, and other sweet-smelling resins were burned to honour the divine and conveniently to cover up the stink of dozens or hundreds of bodies packed into a tight, echoey space. Churches didn't have pews yet, so people stood, fidgeted and occasionally fainted, partially from the heat, partially from the smell. Quirky detail. During long services, people often brought herbs or scented cloths to hold near their faces, not as an act of vanity, but to survive the atmosphere. Some even made little smell cushions stuffed with lavender or hyssop to press to their noses. It was the medieval version of portable air freshener, one that occasionally doubled as a prayer aid, in case you were praying for deliverance from the guy next to you. Nuns, for their part, were usually more hygienic, at least on paper. Some orders emphasised cleanliness as part of their routines. Others, like the Benedictines, had rules requiring regular washing of hands and faces, though again, full baths were rare. Convents often had better access to herbal gardens and clean linens, which nuns used to create their own soaps and tonics. These could smell quite nice, even if the people using them still wore the same dress for a month. But despite all the chanting and washing of feet, church officials weren't immune to the same bodily realities as everyone else. Pilgrims arrived at holy sites with blisters, sores, and all the smells of weeks on the road. The clergy had to tend to them, sometimes by the hundreds. And medieval hospitals, often run by religious orders, were filled with the sick, the injured, and the dying, all in one large open ward. Think of the air, herbal salves mixed with rotting flesh, sweat, blood, and incense. One contemporary observer called it the breath of devotion and decay. Poetic, but not ideal. Now, in terms of spiritual metaphor, smell mattered deeply. A good smell was associated with purity, grace, and even sainthood. A bad smell, sin, corruption, moral decay. There are records of saints said to exude sweet aromas even in death, like roses or spices. Conversely, some heretics or sinners were said to give off a foul stench during execution, as a sign of divine judgment. Which, let's be honest, might just mean they hadn't bathed since the last crusade. There's scholarly debate over how much hygiene was practiced in monasteries compared to secular homes. Some evidence suggests monastic bathhouses existed, especially in wealthier abbeys. Others argue these were rare exceptions, and for most monks cleanliness was a distraction from spiritual discipline. What is clear, though, is that religious communities developed complex rituals around washing, feet on Holy Thursday, hands before meals, but rarely extended those to full-body scrubbing. Clean hands, dirty everything else. Today you're attending morning prayers at a local priory. The church is cold, dark, and lit only by the flickering orange of beeswax candles. As you file in with the other townspeople, the smell hits. Melting wax, damp wool, smoke, and the warm, slightly bitter scent of human presence. The priest greets you with breath that suggests he skipped the vinegar rinse this morning. You bow, inhale through your mouth, and find your place in the crowd. Behind you, someone coughs, wet, rattling. The woman beside you fans herself with her prayer book. The monk at the front swings the censer, and sweet smoke rolls out in waves, cutting through the human haze like a perfumed sword. For a moment, the church smells almost holy, like incense and fresh herbs, but it doesn't last. The body always wins. After the service, you're invited to eat in the priory's guest hall. The food is simple, lentils, bread, weak ale. The monks eat silently, heads bowed. One scratches under his hood, another shifts uncomfortably in his robe. The air is thick with the scent of boiled vegetables, wool, and oil lamps. Someone slurps. No one speaks. You chew quietly and try not to inhale too deeply. Later, when you leave, you pass the communal latrine, a long bench with holes, built over a running stream that's only running sometimes. It smells exactly like you expect. You keep walking. Outside, the wind hits your face. It smells like manure and mud. But compared to what's inside, it's crisp, refreshing. And you realise as you walk back down the path from the priory that even the most pious lives were lived in close contact with dirt, sweat, and scent. Holiness didn't smell like lilies. It smelled like effort, like penance, like feet in worn-out sandals. So here we are, at the tail end of your nasal pilgrimage through medieval filth and funk, and you might be wondering, was it all this bad? Short answer, Yes. Longer answer, also yes, but with layers. Because even as people trudged through the stench of disease, body odour, spoiled food and open latrines, they were also, believe it or not, trying to stay clean, trying to smell good, trying to make sense of hygiene in a world without toothpaste or tile cleaner. And this brings us to the final chapter of our grimy saga, the medieval attempt at cleanliness, the fumbling, fragrant and often futile war against stench. Let's begin with the tooth situation. Dental hygiene in the Middle Ages was an odd mix of folk remedies and desperate improvisation. There were no toothbrushes, not really. Some people used frayed sticks or chewed on herbs like mint, sage or even parsley. Others rubbed their teeth with a cloth dipped in wine or vinegar. Powdered charcoal was popular for whitening, and also for grinding away enamel, and yet medieval skulls often show surprisingly good teeth, at least among the lower classes. Why? Less sugar. No gummy bears, no soda. Their diets, while awful for variety, were decent for avoiding cavities. But breath? Oh, that was another story. No matter how much mint you chewed, if your meals consisted of salted fish, pickled onions, and boiled cabbage, your breath was going to come out swinging. People tried to mask it with cloves, myrrh, or dried orange peel tucked into cheek pouches, essentially medieval gum. A noble might even carry a pomander near their face at all times, not just to ward off disease, but also to keep their own breath from knocking themselves unconscious. Now on to clothes. Washing garments was a monumental task, usually reserved for a few times a year, or when the dirt could no longer be ignored. Woolen garments couldn't be scrubbed or boiled, they'd shrink into doll-sized tunics, so they were brushed, aired out, or beaten with sticks. Linen underclothes were a little easier to wash, so people focused on changing those more often. Wealthy households had laundry staff. Poor folks had a river, a rock, and their own two hands. Soap existed, but it wasn't gentle or luxurious. It was made from animal fat and lye, and it smelled like the ingredients it came from, sharp, bitter, and a little like sadness. If you were fancy, you might have soap scented with herbs. But for the average person, cleanliness came with a price, both in coins and in burned skin. And then there were the herbal warriors, the everyday efforts to smell less like decay and more like a meadow after rain. Lavender, rosemary, thyme and sage were the greatest hits of the medieval deodorizing mixtape. People tied bundles of herbs to their belts, tucked them into clothing folds, or scattered them across rush-covered floors. Some even sewed little scent pouches into their hats or collars, so that, as they walked, they released a faint trail of floral distraction. Personal fragrance was its own little revolution. Perfumes, usually oil-based, were imported from the East and made from resins, spices and flowers. Only the rich could afford them, but even they didn't use perfume in the way we do. It wasn't spritzed on pulse points. It was rubbed on gloves, dabbed into handkerchiefs, or drizzled onto hand towels used before and after meals. You didn't wear scent to be seductive. You wore it to declare that you weren't currently rotting. Quirky note here. People also believed certain scents could protect you from illness. Sweet smells were thought to block the bad airs that carried plague. Vinegar was used to rinse hands, wipe down furniture, and even dabbed onto faces. One popular remedy involved soaking a sponge in vinegar and herbs, then wearing it in a glass pendant around your neck. Others just wore garlic, not to ward off vampires, but because it stank so strongly it was believed no miasma could get through. Effective? Probably not. But dedication? Butter. Bathing itself wasn't entirely abandoned. There were stretches of history, particularly before the Black Death, when public bathhouses flourished. They were social hubs, where men and women sometimes bathed together, awkward yes, shared food and paid extra for scented oils. Bathhouse attendants offered massages, music and hot drinks. It sounds downright spa-like, until the plague hit and everyone decided bathhouses were pestilence pits. By the late medieval period, the idea of full-body washing became suspicious again, especially in water. There's some debate in academic circles about just how often people bathed. Certain records suggest some medieval Europeans bathed more than their 18th century descendants. Others point out that while kings may have had personal bathers, the average peasant might see a full tub once or twice a year, if that. And then there's the semantic confusion. Did washing mean a full bath, or just rinsing your hands and face? The texts don't always clarify, and historians love a good footnote duel. You, today, have finally decided enough is enough. you're going to bathe. You fill a wooden tub in the centre of your one-room home, pouring in buckets of lukewarm water carried from the well. Into the bath you toss some herbs, lavender, marjoram, maybe a few flower petals for flair. You even light a candle. As you lower yourself into the water, it sloshes onto the floor. It's not comfortable. The wood creaks. You smell smoke from the fire, mould from the floor rushes, and a faint hint of yourself despite your best efforts. But still, you feel cleaner. You scrub with a rough cloth, splash water onto your face, soak your feet. For a few minutes, the lice retreat. The itch fades. The scent of rosemary wraps around you like a spell. Afterward, you dry off with a coarse towel, pour the used water out behind the house, and feel something you haven't felt in weeks. Light. Your skin feels air-touched. You dress in your cleanest tunic, still stained but less stiff, and comb your hair with fingers rubbed in rosemary oil. When you step outside, the town still smells like itself. Coal smoke, damp wool, manure, and mystery meat simmering in someone's hearth. But you smell just a little bit different. Not clean, maybe, but better. And in this world, that's all you can ask. Because for all their superstition, confusion, and misguided hygiene science, medieval people weren't oblivious. They wanted to smell good. They tried. They failed, often, but they still tried. And you've survived the stench gauntlet. You faced the garderobe, the chamber pot, the fish cart, and the garlic-soaked peasant. You've walked through plague, passion, prayer, and pickled eels. You've smelled the Middle Ages and lived to tell about it. And now, we've come to the end of our long, pungent journey through the murky mist of medieval hygiene. If your senses haven't completely shut down in self-defense, congratulations. You're stronger than most. You've braved the fumes of unwashed bodies, the tang of spoiled meat stews, the pungent perfume of herbal desperation, and the subtle horror of sleeping next to a chamber pot. You've learned that cleanliness wasn't a given, or even always desirable depending on the century. In fact, for much of medieval life, being too clean was viewed with suspicion, like you might be plotting something. Yet through it all, these people lived, loved, invented, composed poetry, and raised children, often in the same rooms where animals slept and laundry died slow, musty deaths. They scrubbed their soles more often than their feet. They feared bad air, trusted rosemary, and made perfume out of desperation. They built castles with open toilet towers, and still thought silk smelled better when stored next to a chute of human waste. But for all the grime and odour, there's something oddly comforting in the resilience. The medieval world was many things, dangerous, raw, uncomfortable, but it was also resourceful. People adapted, noses adapted. And in a strange way, the history of hygiene is the history of how humanity pushed forward despite the stink. So tonight, as you slip into your own clean sheets, surrounded by the faint whir of a fan and the scent of fabric softener, maybe take a moment to appreciate the little things. Your toothbrush, your soap, your toilet with plumbing that goes somewhere far, far away. And if you dream of medieval times, try not to breathe too deeply.